This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. It was around 2 a.m. when I first noticed something was wrong with the truck. The engine started making an odd knocking sound, and I could feel it losing power as I climbed a steep incline. "Come on, don't do this to me now," I muttered, gripping the steering wheel tighter. I managed to coax the truck to the top of the hill, but as soon as I started down the other side, the engine sputtered and died completely. Cursing under my breath, I guided the truck to the narrow shoulder and put it in park. When I turned the key, all I got was a sad clicking sound. Great. Just great. I slumped back in my seat, trying to decide what to do. I was miles from any town, with no cell service. It was freezing outside. I could see my breath even inside the cab. Spending the night here wasn't an appealing option. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove box and reluctantly stepped out into the frigid night air. A gust of wind cut right through my jacket, making me shiver. The beam of my flashlight barely penetrated the inky darkness surrounding me. I popped the hood and started examining the engine, though I knew next to nothing about car repair. As I was fiddling uselessly with wires and hoses, the hairs on the back of my neck suddenly stood up. I had the distinct feeling I was being watched. I straightened up and shone my flashlight into the woods, but saw nothing but trees. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I tried to focus on the engine again, but kept glancing nervously over my shoulder. That's when I saw him for the first time. A man standing in the middle of the road, about 50 yards behind my truck. He was wearing a long, dark coat and just standing there, staring in my direction. I hadn't heard any cars pass. Where had he come from? "Hey!" I called out, my voice sounding small in the vast darkness. "Do you need help?" The man didn't respond or move. He just kept staring. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Something about this felt very wrong. I slammed the hood shut and hurried back to the driver's side door, keeping my eyes on the stranger. Just as I was about to get in, he suddenly raised his arm and beckoned to me with one finger. "No thanks," I said shakily. "I'm good." I scrambled into the truck and locked the doors, heart pounding. When I looked back at the road, the man was gone. Had I imagined him? I rubbed my eyes, wondering if exhaustion was making me see things. But then I saw movement in my side mirror and let out a strangled yelp. The man was now standing right next to my truck, peering in the window. His face was gaunt and pale, with dark sunken eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. He smiled, revealing yellowed teeth, and tapped on the glass with a long, bony finger. "Let me in," he mouthed silently. "I can help you." I shook my head frantically. "Go away," I shouted, though my voice came out as more of a terrified squeak. The man's smile widened unnaturally, stretching to the edges of his face. He began scratching at the window with his nails, making a sound like nails on a chalkboard. I covered my ears and squeezed my eyes shut, praying this was all just a bad dream. When I opened my eyes again, he was gone. I let out a shaky breath, trying to calm my racing heart. What the hell was happening? I had to get out of here. I turned the key again, silently begging the engine to start. To my immense relief, it sputtered to life. I threw the truck into drive and stomped on the gas, tires squealing as I pulled back onto the road. In my rearview mirror, I could see the man standing in the road where my truck had been, watching me drive away. I pressed the gas pedal to the floor. I'd only gone about a mile when my headlights illuminated a figure in the road ahead. My blood ran cold as I recognized the man in the dark coat, standing directly in my path with his arms outstretched. I swerved hard to avoid him, nearly going off the road. When I looked back, he was gone again. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep hold of the steering wheel. This couldn't be real. It wasn't possible. "It's not real," I said out loud, trying to convince myself. "You're just tired. You're seeing things." But even as I said it, I saw him again, standing on the side of the road, that horrifying grin still plastered on his face. I blinked, and he vanished, only to reappear farther down the road. It was like he was toying with me, letting me know I couldn't escape. I don't know how long this went on. It felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes or so. The man kept appearing and disappearing, always a little closer, always with that terrifying smile. Sometimes he'd reach out for the truck as I sped past. Once I swear I felt icy fingers brush the back of my neck, but when I whipped my head around, the back seat was empty. I was in full panic mode now, driving way too fast on the twisting mountain road. Tears streamed down my face as I pleaded with the universe to let this nightmare end. I didn't even know where I was going anymore. I just knew I had to get away. As I came flying around a sharp curve, my headlights suddenly illuminated a "Welcome to Pine Creek" sign. I'd never been so happy to see a town in my life. I screeched to a halt in front of the first building I saw, a small 24-hour diner. I threw myself out of the truck and ran inside, probably looking like a complete maniac. There were only two people there, an older waitress behind the counter and a trucker sitting in a booth. "Are you all right, hon?" the waitress asked, looking concerned. "You're white as a sheet." I collapsed into the nearest seat, my whole body trembling. "There was a man," I stammered. "On the road. He kept appearing. It wasn't possible. I don't know how." I burst into tears, all the fear and adrenaline finally overwhelming me. The waitress hurried over and put a comforting hand on my shoulder. "It's okay. You're safe now. Why don't I get you some coffee and you can tell us what happened?" Over the next hour, I recounted my terrifying experience to the waitress and the trucker. They exchanged worried glances as I talked. "I've heard stories about that stretch of road," the trucker said when I finished. "Lots of folks report seeing strange things out there at night. Some say it's the ghost of a man who froze to death out there years ago. He tries to lure in drivers to share his fate." I shuddered. Ghost or not, I am never driving that road again, especially not at night. The waitress insisted I stay until morning, which I gladly agreed to. When the sun came up, I got back in my truck and drove home, sticking to busy highways the whole way. It's been years, but I still get chills thinking about that night. I've never been able to explain what I saw. Was it a ghost, a hallucination, some kind of demon? I don't know. But sometimes I still dream about that pale face and those glowing eyes. And I know I'll never forget the night I was stalked by the man on the icy mountain road. As we rounded a bend, my headlights suddenly illuminated a figure standing motionless on the side of the road. I instinctively slowed the car, squinting to try and make out who it was. "What are you doing?" Natalie asked, sounding concerned. "Don't stop." But something made me hesitate. The figure was just standing there, unmoving. I couldn't see their face clearly in the darkness. "Hello?" I called out the window as we crawled past. "Do you need help?" The figure's head slowly turned to face us. In the glow of the taillights, I caught a glimpse of sunken eyes in a gaunt, pale face. A chill ran down my spine. "Jake, drive!" Natalie urged, grabbing my arm. I pressed the gas pedal, heart pounding. In the rearview mirror, I saw the figure still watching us, unblinking. "What the hell was that about?" Natalie demanded, once we'd put some distance between us and the stranger. You know better than to stop for random people on dark roads." "I don't know," I admitted. "Something just felt off, like they needed help or something." Natalie shook her head. "Well, next time listen to your girlfriend instead of your hero complex. That was creepy as hell." I nodded, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. We drove on in silence for a while, both lost in our own thoughts. The trees seemed to press in closer on either side of the road, creating a tunnel of darkness broken only by my headlights. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the forest, like a massive tree branch snapping. Natalie and I both jumped. "What was that?" she whispered. "Probably just an animal," I said, not entirely convinced. The sounds continued, snaps and rustles coming from the woods, always just out of sight. It sounded like something large was moving parallel to the road, keeping pace with our car. "Jake," Natalie's voice quavered, "I really don't like this. Can you go faster?" I pressed down harder on the accelerator, the old Toyota's engine whining in protest. The sounds kept up with us effortlessly. A flash of movement caught my eye and I jerked the wheel, nearly running off the road. Something dark had darted between the trees, keeping pace with the car. "Did you see that?" I gasped. Natalie nodded, eyes wide with fear. "What's happening?" "I don't know, but we need to get out of here." I floored it, the speedometer creeping up past 80. The wind howled past the windows, but it couldn't drown out the cacophony of snapping branches and rustling leaves that pursued us through the forest. Out of the corner of my eye, I kept seeing fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures flitting between the trees. Every time I tried to focus on one, it would vanish. But I could feel their presence, watching us hungrily as we sped down the road. Natalie was visibly shaking now, hugging herself tightly. "Jake, I'm scared," she whimpered. "It's okay," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "We're almost there, just a few more miles." But those last few miles felt like an eternity. The pounding in my chest was so loud, I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. My palms were slick with sweat on the steering wheel. Finally, mercifully, we saw the turnoff for Natalie's family farm up ahead. I took the corner way too fast, tires squealing. We bounced down the long gravel driveway, rocks pinging off the undercarriage. I slammed on the brakes as we reached the farmhouse, not even bothering to park properly. We scrambled out of the car and ran for the porch. Natalie fumbled with her keys, hands shaking so bad she could barely get them in the lock. "Hurry!" I hissed, glancing back at the trees lining the property. Shadows seemed to writhe and dance at the edge of the forest. We burst through the door and I slammed it behind us, throwing the deadbolt. For a long moment we just stood there in the dark entryway, panting heavily. What was that?" Natalie finally whispered. I shook my head. "I don't know, but I've never been so terrified in my life." We spent a restless night huddled together on the couch, jumping at every creak of the old farmhouse settling. I kept expecting to see pale faces peering in through the windows, but nothing came. When morning finally dawned, the forest looked perfectly normal and peaceful, but we both knew what we had experienced. The memory of that night stayed with us, tainting what should have been a relaxing country getaway. We barely spoke during the drive back to the city on Sunday, both lost in our own thoughts, processing what had happened. I took a different route home, adding an hour to the trip just to avoid that stretch of road. It's been months now, but I still think about that night constantly. What was out there in those woods? What would have happened if we'd broken down, or if I'd gotten out of the car to help that stranger? Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all. The pursuit through the forest, the shadowy figures. But then I look at Natalie and see the same haunted look in her eyes. She was there. She saw it too. We've been back to visit her family a few times since then. We always take the long way around now, but even seeing those woods in the distance sends a shiver down my spine. I can feel eyes on us, watching and waiting. I don't know if we'll ever understand what happened that night. Part of me doesn't want to know, but I do know one thing. I'll never stop on a dark country road again, no matter who or what I see. Some things are better left alone in the shadows. It was late July, and we were in the midst of a brutal heat wave. The air was thick and oppressive, like a heavy blanket smothering the entire town. My 6-year-old son Arthur had been going stir-crazy, cooped up in the house all day, so when the first rumbles of thunder rolled in that evening, I decided to take him out to watch the storm from our backyard gazebo. Arthur loved thunderstorms. His eyes would light up with excitement at each flash of lightning, followed by gleeful giggles as he counted the seconds until the boom of thunder. I have to admit, I enjoyed them too. There was something primal and awe-inspiring about witnessing nature's raw power on display. We settled into the old wooden gazebo as the first fat raindrops began to fall. Arthur pressed his face against the screen, his breath fogging up the mesh as he peered out at the darkening sky. I sat back in one of the creaky Adirondack chairs, content to watch my son's wonderment. The storm picked up quickly. Soon, sheets of rain were lashing against the gazebo, driven sideways by howling winds. Brilliant forks of lightning split the sky every few seconds, followed almost instantly by deafening cracks of thunder. Arthur squealed in delight, clapping his hands over his ears at the loudest booms. As much as I was enjoying the storm and my son's excitement, a nagging sense of unease began to creep over me. At first, I couldn't put my finger on what was bothering me, but as another flash of lightning illuminated the yard, I realized what it was. There was someone standing at the edge of the woods behind our property. I blinked, sure I must have imagined it. But when the next lightning strike lit up the landscape, the figure was still there, a tall, lean silhouette, barely distinguishable from the trees, just watching. "Arthur," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "come sit with Daddy for a minute." He bounded over happily and climbed into my lap. I wrapped my arms around him protectively, my eyes scanning the tree line. For several long moments, I saw nothing. Then another flash, and there it was again, closer this time. Close enough that I could make out more details. It was definitely human-shaped, but something about the proportions seemed off. The arms hung too low, nearly to the knees. The head was oddly elongated, and though I couldn't make out any facial features in the darkness, I had the distinct impression it was staring directly at us. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the storm. "Hey, buddy," I said to Arthur, forcing a smile. "I think that's enough storm watching for tonight. Let's head inside, okay?" "Aw, do we have to?" he pouted. "It's just getting to the good part." I know, but it's getting late and we don't want Mom to worry. Tell you what, how about we make some hot chocolate and watch a movie instead?" That did the trick. Arthur's face lit up and he scrambled off my lap, heading for the gazebo door. I cast one last glance toward the woods as we left. Nothing. Whatever I'd seen, if I'd really seen anything at all, was gone. Back in the house, I went through the motions of making hot chocolate and setting up a movie, all while trying to convince myself that my eyes had been playing tricks on me. It was dark, stormy. Surely I'd just seen an oddly shaped tree or something. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I tucked Arthur into bed after the movie, making sure his nightlight was on and leaving the door cracked open as usual. As I headed to my own room, I found myself double-checking that all the doors and windows were locked, just in case. I tossed and turned for hours, unable to shake the image of that strange figure from my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it there, lurking at the edge of the woods, watching, waiting. A loud crack of thunder jolted me awake sometime in the early hours of the morning. For a moment, I was disoriented. Then I realized the storm was still raging outside. I glanced at the clock, 3:17 a.m. As I lay there listening to the rain pelt against the windows, a floorboard creaked in the hallway. My heart leapt into my throat. Probably just the house settling, I told myself. Old houses make all kinds of noises. But then I heard it again and again. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming closer to my room. I sat up, straining my ears. The footsteps stopped just outside my door. For several agonizing seconds, there was only silence. Then, ever so slowly, the doorknob began to turn. I was frozen in place, my breath caught in my chest. The door inched open, revealing nothing, just the dark hallway beyond. I let out a shaky breath. Get a grip, I chided myself. You're letting your imagination run wild. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, intending to check on Arthur, and then maybe make some tea to calm my nerves. That's when a flash of lightning illuminated the hallway, and I saw it. The figure from the woods, its unnaturally long limbs nearly touching both walls as it filled the doorway. In that split second of brightness, I caught a glimpse of its face, if you could call it that. Where features should have been, there was only smooth, pale skin. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just blank. I scrambled backward, a scream lodged in my throat. By the time my back hit the headboard, darkness had fallen again. I fumbled frantically for the lamp on my nightstand, my fingers clumsy with fear. Light flooded the room. The doorway was empty. For a long moment I sat there gasping for air, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Had I imagined it? Was I losing my mind? A child's scream cut through the night, snapping me back to reality. Arthur! I bolted from the bed, nearly tripping over my own feet in my haste to get to my son's room. I burst through the door to find him sitting up in bed, tears streaming down his face. "Daddy," he sobbed, "there's a man outside my window." I rushed to the window, yanking back the curtains. At first I saw nothing but rain-slicked darkness. Then a flash of lightning revealed a pale, eyeless face pressed against the glass. I stumbled backward, pulling Arthur into my arms. "It's okay, buddy," I said, my voice shaking. "Daddy's here. Everything's going to be all right." But even as I said the words, I knew they weren't true. Because in that moment, I heard the unmistakable sound of our back door creaking open downstairs. What happened next is still a blur. I remember grabbing Arthur and running, down the stairs, out the front door, into the storm-lashed night. We piled into the car, and I drove, tires squealing on the wet pavement, no destination in mind except away. We ended up at my sister's house 2 towns over. She was understandably confused and concerned. When we showed up on her doorstep at 4 a.m., soaking wet and wild-eyed, I mumbled something about a break-in, not ready or able to explain what had really happened. We never went back to that house. I hired movers to pack up our belongings while we stayed with my sister. My wife thought I was having some kind of breakdown, and honestly, sometimes I wondered if she was right. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that blank, featureless face, and I knew with bone-deep certainty that what I'd seen was real. We moved to a new town, started fresh. Things slowly got back to normal, or something resembling normal. Arthur stopped having nightmares. My wife stopped giving me worried looks. when she thought I wasn't paying attention. But I'll never forget that night. And sometimes, when the wind howls and thunder shakes the windows, I find myself glancing nervously at the tree line, half expecting to see a tall, lean figure emerging from the shadows, watching, waiting. I don't know what that thing was or what it wanted. I don't know why it targeted us or why it suddenly disappeared. But I do know this. There are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk in the darkness just beyond the edge of what we understand. And sometimes, if we're very unlucky, those things decide to pay us a visit. So the next time you're cozied up in your home on a stormy night, thinking you're safe from the chaos outside, take a moment to check the locks. Draw the curtains, and whatever you do, don't look too closely at the shadows in the corner of your eye, because you never know what might be looking back. I was so excited to move into my new place. After months of searching, I'd finally found the perfect house. A charming old Victorian with lots of character. Sure, it needed some work, but I saw so much potential. The landlord gave me a great deal on the rent, too. I should have known it was too good to be true. The first few days were uneventful as I settled in and started unpacking. I loved exploring all the little quirks and details of the old house. The creaky floorboards, the ornate moldings, the antique doorknobs. It had such a rich history, and I found myself imagining all the families who must have lived here over the decades. It wasn't until about a week after moving in that I discovered the basement. I'd assumed the door in the kitchen just led to a small storage closet. But when I finally got around to opening it, I was surprised to find a steep set of stairs leading down into darkness. Curiously, I flicked on the light switch and made my way down. The basement was musty and damp, filled with cobwebs and decades' worth of dust and junk left behind by previous tenants. Old furniture, broken appliances, stacks of moldering cardboard boxes. As I picked my way through the clutter, something caught my eye. A section of wall that looked slightly different from the rest. Brushing away cobwebs, I ran my hand along the surface and felt a slight give. My heart started racing as I realized there was a hidden door, perfectly camouflaged to blend in with the surrounding wall. With trembling fingers, I searched for some kind of latch or handle. Finally, I felt a small notch and pulled. The door swung open with a groan, revealing a dark passageway beyond. A chill ran down my spine, but my curiosity got the better of me. Pulling out my phone for light, I ducked through the doorway and found myself in a narrow, dank corridor that seemed to stretch on into blackness. I don't know how long I walked, but it felt like the passageway went on forever, twisting and turning. Just as I was about to give up and turn back, I came to another door, this one heavy and wooden, with an old-fashioned iron lock. My hands were shaking as I tried the handle, but it was locked tight. I should have left well enough alone. I should have turned around and forgotten all about it, but something compelled me to keep going. I ran back upstairs and grabbed a set of lockpicks I had, don't ask, then hurried back down to the mysterious door. It took some fiddling, but eventually I heard a satisfying click as the lock gave way. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The hinges creaked ominously as it swung inward, revealing a small, dimly lit room beyond. And there, sitting in the center of the room in an old wooden rocking chair, was a little girl. My blood ran cold. She looked to be about 8 or 9 years old, with long dark hair and a tattered white dress. But her skin was deathly pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, God, her eyes, they were completely black, like empty voids staring into my soul. I stood frozen in the doorway, unable to move or speak. The girl's head slowly turned towards me, her black eyes locking onto mine. And then, in a voice that sounded like it came from the grave, she spoke. "Why did you leave me?" A jolt of terror shot through me. I stumbled backwards, slamming the door shut and running blindly back through the passageway. I didn't stop until I was back upstairs in the kitchen, gasping for breath and trying to convince myself it had all been a hallucination. But I knew deep down it was real. And over the next few days, strange things started happening around the house. Objects would move on their own when I wasn't looking. I'd catch glimpses of a small figure darting just out of sight. At night, I'd wake up to the sound of a child's laughter echoing through the halls. And always, always, I felt those black eyes watching me, judging me, accusing me. I tried to go about my normal routine, telling myself I was just stressed and imagining things. But the incidents kept escalating. One morning I woke up to find childish drawings covering my bedroom walls, stick figures of a little girl and an adult, over and over again. Another day all the photos in the house had been turned to face the wall. The final straw came about a week after my encounter in the basement. I was in the kitchen making dinner when I heard a quiet voice behind me. "Why did you leave me, Daddy?" I whirled around to find the ghostly girl standing there, her black eyes boring into me. Before I could react, every cabinet door in the kitchen suddenly flew open, dishes and glasses exploding outwards in a deafening crash. I ran. I didn't even stop to grab any of my belongings. I just ran out of that house and didn't look back. I called the landlord from a motel that night and told him I was breaking the lease, that he could keep my security deposit. He didn't even seem surprised. It's been months now, and I still have nightmares about those black eyes and that accusing voice. I've tried researching the history of the house, looking for any clues about who that little girl might have been. But I've found nothing concrete. Just vague rumors about past tenants experiencing strange phenomena and whispered stories of tragedy and loss. I don't know if I'll ever understand what really happened in that basement. Was it truly a ghost, some kind of demonic entity, or just a manifestation of my own buried guilt and trauma? All I know is that I'll never set foot in that house again, and I'll always wonder, who was that little girl, and why did she think I had abandoned her? Sometimes late at night, when the shadows grow long and the world feels thin, I swear I can still hear her voice echoing in my mind. Why did you leave me? It's a question that will haunt me for the rest of my days. As I rounded a sharp curve, my headlights suddenly illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, heart pounding as I skidded to a stop just inches from hitting the person. It was a man, dressed entirely in white. He stood perfectly still, facing away from me, seemingly oblivious to the fact that he'd nearly been run over. "Hey!" I called out, rolling down my window. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The man didn't respond or even turn around. I honked my horn, but he remained motionless. A chill ran down my spine. Something about this didn't feel right. After a moment's hesitation, I slowly started to edge my car forward, giving the man a wide berth as I drove around him. As I passed, I got a better look at his outfit. It appeared to be an old-fashioned suit, like something from the 1950s or 60s. The fabric seemed to glow faintly in my headlights. I breathed a sigh of relief once I was past him. In my rear-view mirror, I watched the figure grow smaller and disappear into the rainy darkness. What a strange encounter, I thought to myself. Why would anyone be out walking on a night like this, especially dressed like that? I tried to shake off the unsettling feeling as I continued down the road. But less than a mile later, my blood ran cold. There, illuminated in my headlights once again, was the same man in white, standing in the exact same position, directly in my path. This time I swerved sharply to avoid him, my tires squealing on the wet pavement. How was this possible? There's no way he could have gotten ahead of me so quickly. As I straightened out my car, I glanced in the mirror again. The man was gone. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel now. This couldn't be happening. I must be more tired than I realized. I was seeing things, that's all. I decided to pull over at the next gas station or store. I saw to splash some water on my face and get my bearings. But there were no signs of civilization out here, just endless dark forest on either side of the road. And then, to my horror, I saw him again, the man in white standing in the road, growing larger in my windshield as I approached. I jerked the wheel hard, desperate to avoid hitting him. My tires lost traction on the slick road, and I went into a spin. The world whirled around me as I lost control. There was a sickening crunch of metal and breaking glass as my car slammed into something solid. When everything stopped moving, I found myself dazed but conscious, my car wrapped around a large tree just off the road. Steam hissed from the crumpled hood. I gingerly touched my forehead and my fingers came away bloody. As I fumbled for my phone to call for help, movement caught my eye. Through the cracked windshield, I saw the man in white slowly walking towards my car. Panic seized me. I tried to start the engine, but it was dead. The door was jammed shut. I was trapped. The figure drew closer, his face still hidden in shadow. Just as he was about to reach my door, bright lights suddenly flooded the area. The sound of sirens pierced the night. Police cars and an ambulance pulled up, their red and blue lights cutting through the rain. The man in white was gone. Everything after that was a blur. Paramedics extracted me from the wreck and loaded me into the ambulance. Officers asked me questions about what happened, but I was too shaken to give coherent answers. It wasn't until hours later, as I lay in a hospital bed being treated for a concussion and some cuts and bruises, that I was able to tell my story. The police officer listening to me exchanged a look with his partner when I described the man in white. "You're not the first one to see him," he said quietly. "We get reports of a figure matching that description on this stretch of road every few years, always on rainy nights." A chill ran through me. "What do you mean? Who is he?" The officer sighed. "According to local legend, about 50 years ago there was a terrible accident on that road. A man's wife and young daughter were killed when their car went off the road during a storm. The man was devastated. He spent years wandering that road in all weather, searching for them. Eventually he died of exposure one winter night." I stared at him in disbelief. "Are you saying I saw a ghost?" He shrugged. "I'm just telling you what I've heard. Make of it what you will, but I'd advise staying off that road on rainy nights from now on." I was released from the hospital the next day, still struggling to process what had happened. Part of me wanted to dismiss it all as a hallucination brought on by fatigue and the poor driving conditions, but I couldn't shake the memory of that glowing white suit, the unnatural stillness of the figure, the way he seemed to appear out of nowhere again and again. In the weeks that followed, I found myself obsessively researching the history of that road. I scoured old newspaper archives and talked to longtime residents of the area. Gradually, I pieced together more of the story. The man's name was Edward Carlyle. He had been driving home with his wife Margaret and 6-year-old daughter Emily on a stormy night in 1972 when tragedy struck. Their car hydroplaned and went off the road, plunging into a deep ravine. Edward survived, but Margaret and Emily were killed instantly. Consumed by grief and guilt, Edward became convinced that his family's spirits were still out there somewhere. He would spend hours walking up and down that stretch of road, calling their names, begging for a sign. People in town started avoiding him, disturbed by his erratic behavior. As the years went by, Edward's obsession only grew. He lost his job, his home, everything. But still he persisted in his nightly vigils on that lonely road, until one bitter January night in 1978, when his body was found frozen in a ditch. He was still wearing the white suit he had on the night of the accident, the outfit he superstitiously believed would help his wife and daughter recognize him. The more I learned, the more I became convinced that I had encountered Edward's restless spirit that night. Was he still searching for his lost family after all these years? Or was he trying to warn other drivers to avoid his fate? I've driven down that road many times since then, always in clear weather. I've never seen the man in white again. But on rainy nights, I find myself thinking of Edward Carlyle. I hope that someday he finds whatever it is he's looking for out there in the darkness, and that he finally finds peace. In the meantime, I've learned to be more cautious on the road, especially in bad weather. You never know what or who might be waiting around the next bend. Some mysteries are best left unsolved, some roads best left untraveled. But the memory of that eerie encounter will stay with me always, a reminder that there are things in this world that defy rational explanation. I still get chills when I think about how close I came to a very different ending that night. Was it luck that saved me? Or was there some purpose to my encounter with the man in white? I may never know for sure, but I do know that I'll never look at a rainy night the same way again. I recently moved into an old house on Maple Street, thinking it would be the perfect place to start fresh and build a new life. Little did I know that this seemingly charming home would soon become the setting for a series of unexplainable and downright terrifying events that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the world. It all started on my first night in the house. I was unpacking boxes in the living room when I heard a faint creaking sound coming from the basement. At first, I brushed it off as just the house settling, but as the night wore on, the sound became more persistent. It was a rhythmic creaking, almost like someone was gently rocking back and forth. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. Armed with just my phone's flashlight, I made my way down the creaky wooden stairs to the basement. The air was thick with the musty smell of age and neglect. As I swept my light across the room, my breath caught in my throat. There, in the far corner, was an old wooden rocking chair, moving ever so slightly on its own. I approached it cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The chair was ornate with intricate carvings on the armrests and backrest. It looked antique, probably as old as the house itself. As I got closer, the rocking suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I reached out to touch the chair, half expecting it to be warm from recent use. Instead, it was ice cold, sending a shiver down my spine. I quickly retreated upstairs, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was just a draft, I told myself. Old houses are full of quirks, right? The next day, I asked my realtor about the previous owners of the house. She told me that it had belonged to a woman named Eleanor Martin, a widow who had lived there for over 5 decades before passing away peacefully in her sleep. The house had been empty for a few years before I bought it. I tried to go about my days normally, unpacking and settling in, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the house. Objects would move when I wasn't looking, doors would close on their own, and that creaking sound from the basement continued every night like clockwork. Unable to stand it any longer, I decided to get rid of the rocking chair. I lugged it up the stairs and out to the curb for the garbage collectors to take away. That night, I slept soundly for the first time since moving in, relieved to be free of the eerie presence. But my relief was short-lived. The next morning, I went down to the basement to grab some tools, and there it was. The rocking chair was back in its corner, looking as if it had never left. I stood there, frozen in disbelief. This couldn't be happening. I distinctly remembered the effort it took to carry that heavy chair up the stairs and out of the house. Panic set in, and I ran upstairs, grabbing my phone to call a friend. As I dialed, I heard the creaking again, louder this time. It was coming from upstairs. With trembling legs, I climbed the stairs, following the sound to the master bedroom. The door was ajar, and as I pushed it open, I saw her. An elderly woman, translucent and glowing with a soft blue light, was sitting in the rocking chair. She turned to look at me, her eyes sad but kind. I wanted to run, to scream, but I was rooted to the spot. "Hello," she said, her voice echoing as if from a great distance. "I'm Eleanor. I hope you don't mind that I brought my chair back. It's been with me for so long, you see." I couldn't believe what I was seeing or hearing. A ghost, an actual ghost, was talking to me. I'm sorry," I stammered. "I didn't know." Eleanor smiled gently. "Of course you didn't, dear. How could you? I should be the one apologizing. I didn't mean to frighten you. This house, it's been my home for so long. I'm not quite ready to leave it yet." As we talked, I began to understand. Eleanor had lived a long, happy life in this house. She had raised her children here, grown old with her husband, and even after he passed, she had found comfort in the familiar surroundings. The rocking chair had been a wedding gift, and she had spent countless hours in it, reading to her children, knitting, and watching the world go by from her porch. "I know it's not my home anymore," Eleanor said softly, "but I hoped I could stay just a little longer, to watch over the place, to make sure it's cared for." I found myself nodding, my fear slowly ebbing away. I think that would be okay," I heard myself say. "But maybe we could move the chair somewhere else? The basement is so dark and lonely." Eleanor's face lit up with joy. "Oh, that would be wonderful. I always did prefer the living room. The light is so much better for reading." Together, we moved the rocking chair to the living room. As I positioned it near the window, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The house didn't feel scary anymore. It felt like home. From that day on, strange things still happened in the house, but they no longer frightened me. Sometimes I'd find a book open on the coffee table that I hadn't been reading, or I'd smell the faint scent of lavender and vanilla, Eleanor's favorite tea. The rocking chair would creak gently in the evenings, and I'd smile, knowing Eleanor was enjoying her home. I never told anyone about my ghostly housemate. Who would believe me? But I came to appreciate her presence. She was a quiet, comforting companion, a link to the history of the house and the lives that had been lived within its walls. As weeks turned into months, I found myself talking to Eleanor more often. I'd tell her about my day, ask for advice, or sometimes just sit in comfortable silence as we both enjoyed the view from the living room window. She never appeared as clearly as she had that first night, but I could always sense when she was near. One particularly stormy night, as the wind howled outside and rain lashed against the windows, I heard Eleanor's voice clearer than I had in months. "Thank you," she said, her tone filled with gratitude and peace. "For understanding, for sharing your home with me. I think it's time for me to move on now." I felt a mix of sadness and acceptance wash over me. "Are you sure?" I asked the empty room, knowing she could hear me. "Yes, dear," came the faint reply. "You've helped me more than you know. This house is in good hands now. I can rest easy." A warm breeze swept through the room, carrying the scent of lavender and vanilla. The rocking chair creaked one last time, and then all was still. I knew deep in my heart that Eleanor was gone. The house felt different after that night. Not empty, but peaceful. The rocking chair remained in the living room, a reminder of the unexpected friendship I had formed and the lessons I had learned about compassion, understanding, and the enduring power of home. As I sit here now, writing this story, I can't help but glance at the old rocking chair. It hasn't moved on its own since that night, but sometimes when the light hits it just right, I swear I can see Eleanor's smile reflected in the polished wood, and I smile back, grateful for the ghost who taught me that sometimes the most extraordinary experiences can come from the most ordinary places. The next day, I decided to explore the attic properly. As I poked around, I noticed a section of wall that seemed out of place. When I pushed on it, a hidden door swung open, revealing a small, dark room I hadn't known existed. The air inside was stale and musty. My skin crawled as I peered into the gloom, but I couldn't see much. That night, the scratching sounds were louder. They seemed to be coming from that hidden room. I lay awake, heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Around 3 a.m. I heard a thump and then shuffling footsteps overhead. Terrified but determined to face whatever it was, I grabbed a flashlight and crept up to the attic. The beam of light swept across the dusty floor as I approached the hidden room. The door was ajar. With trembling hands, I pushed it open wider. What I saw made my blood run cold. Huddled in the corner was a woman with wild matted hair. Her clothes were tattered and filthy. When the light hit her face, she let out an inhuman shriek and scrambled towards me on all fours, her eyes wide and feral. I stumbled backwards, slamming the door shut. I could hear her throwing herself against it, wailing and clawing at the wood. I ran downstairs and out of the house, spending the rest of the night in my car. When morning came, I called the police. They searched the entire house but found no trace of the woman. The hidden room was empty with no signs anyone had been living there. They clearly thought I was crazy or drunk. I insisted on what I'd seen, but they just exchanged looks and said they'd keep an eye on the property. I couldn't bring myself to stay another night. I packed up my essentials and checked into a motel. Over the next few days, I went back during daylight hours to gather the rest of my things. Each time I'd hear faint scratching from the attic, but I was too scared to investigate further. I put the house on the market immediately, disclosing the hidden room but not my experience. It sold quickly to an investor who planned to renovate. Part of me felt guilty, wondering if I should warn them. But what could I say that wouldn't sound completely insane? It's been a few months now, and I still have nightmares about that woman's face. I've tried researching the house's history, looking for any clues about who she might have been or how she ended up there. But I've found nothing concrete. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, but then I remember the raw terror I felt. The sound of her nails on the door, the wild look in her eyes. It was all too real. I don't know if she was a ghost, a squatter, or something else entirely. All I know is that I'll never set foot in that house again. I still drive by occasionally, half expecting to see her face in one of the windows. The new owners seem to be happily renovating. I hope they never discover what's lurking in that hidden room. Or maybe I hope they do, just so I'll know I'm not crazy. The experience has left me shaken and questioning everything I thought I knew about reality. How could a person, if that's what she was, survive hidden away like that? And how did she vanish without a trace? I've tried talking to a therapist about it, but I can tell they don't really believe me. I've searched online forums for similar experiences, but nothing quite matches up. I feel isolated, carrying this secret that no one else seems to understand or believe. The worst part is the lingering fear that somehow she'll find me again. Sometimes at night, I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I hear scratching at my bedroom door. It's never real, of course, but the terror feels just as intense as it did that night in the attic. I've become hyper-aware of every creaky floorboard, every shadow in the corner of my eye. I check and double-check that all the doors and windows are locked before I go to bed. I've installed security cameras around my new place, partly for peace of mind and partly hoping to catch a glimpse of her if she ever does show up. Friends have noticed the change in me. I'm jumpier, more withdrawn. I make excuses not to visit their homes, especially if they live in older buildings. The thought of being in another attic or hidden space fills me with dread. I've tried to move on, to forget about it, and chalk it up to an overactive imagination or a vivid nightmare. But I can't shake the feeling that there's more to the story. Who was she? How long had she been there? Were the previous owners aware of her presence? And most chillingly, is she still there, waiting for the next unsuspecting resident? I've considered going back, trying to investigate further, but every time I get close to the neighborhood, panic sets in. My hands shake, my vision blurs, and I have to turn around and head home. Sometimes I catch myself staring at the walls of my new apartment, wondering if there are hidden spaces here too. What secrets might old houses keep? How many other people have experiences like mine but are too afraid or embarrassed to speak up? I know this sounds crazy. If someone had told me this story a year ago, I would have laughed it off or assumed they were exaggerating. But now, I'm not so sure about anything anymore. The world seems darker, full of unseen threats and inexplicable phenomena. All I can do is try to move forward, to rebuild my sense of safety and normalcy. But a part of me will always be back in that attic, face to face with the impossible. And a part of me will always be wondering, where is she now? And will I ever truly be free of her? I hope that by sharing this, maybe someone out there will recognize the story. Maybe they've had a similar experience or know something about the history of that house. Or maybe they'll just believe me, which would be a comfort in itself. Because living with this secret, this lingering doubt about my own sanity, is almost as terrifying as that night in the attic. So if you're reading this and you've ever encountered something you can't explain, know that you're not alone. And if you're thinking of buying an old house with a great deal, maybe think twice. Some bargains come with hidden costs that no amount of money can offset. As for me, I'm learning to live with the uncertainty, but I'll never look at an attic the same way again. And I'll always wonder about the woman in the hidden room and whether our paths will ever cross again. The day we moved in, we were eager to start exploring every nook and cranny of our new place. As we were unpacking boxes in the master bedroom, I noticed a slight gap in the wooden paneling along one wall. Curious, I ran my hand along it and felt a slight give. With a bit of pressure, a hidden door swung open, revealing a small room we hadn't known existed. Jack and I exchanged shocked looks before peering inside. It was a tiny space, maybe 6 feet by 8 feet with no windows. A thick layer of dust covered everything. The air felt heavy and stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in decades. An old wooden chair sat in one corner, and some shelves lined the walls, but they were empty. As soon as I stepped inside, I felt a chill run down my spine. There was just something off about the energy in there. I can't explain it, but every instinct was screaming at me to get out. Jack must have felt it too, because he quickly suggested we close it back up and deal with it later. We tried to brush it off and focus on unpacking, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept imagining I heard faint noises coming from behind the wall, scratching sounds, whispers. I told myself it was just an old house settling, but deep down, I knew it was something more. Over the next few weeks, strange things started happening with increasing frequency. Objects would be moved from where we left them. We'd hear footsteps in the hallway when we were the only ones home. The temperature would suddenly drop in certain rooms for no reason. I started to dread being alone in the house. Even with Jack there, I constantly felt like I was being watched. Out of the corner of my eye, I'd catch glimpses of movement, only for nothing to be there when I turned to look. One night, things escalated dramatically. I woke up around 3 a.m. with an overwhelming sense of dread. As I lay there trying to calm my racing heart, I heard slow, heavy footsteps coming down the hall towards our bedroom. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to wake Jack or even turn my head to look. The footsteps stopped right outside our door. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying whatever it was would go away. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the doorknob slowly turning. Gathering all my courage, I forced myself to open my eyes and look. There, silhouetted in the doorway, was a tall, dark figure. It was pitch black, like a shadow-given form. I couldn't make out any features, just an oppressive, malevolent presence. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Suddenly, Jack stirred beside me. In the split second I glanced at him, the figure vanished. I burst into tears, finally able to move. Jack held me as I sobbed, insisting he hadn't seen or heard anything. The next day, we decided we needed answers. We tracked down the previous owners, an elderly couple named the Johnsons who had moved to Florida. When we called and described what was happening, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, Mrs. Johnson spoke in a shaky voice. She told us they had experienced similar phenomena during their 40 years in the house. It had started small, cold spots, items going missing. But over time, it escalated to full apparitions and terrifying encounters. They had multiple psychics and paranormal investigators come to the house over the years. All of them were drawn to that hidden room, saying it was a focal point of negative energy, some kind of portal or tear in the veil between worlds. The Johnsons had the room sealed up about 10 years ago on the advice of a medium. Things had quieted down after that, which is why they felt okay selling the house. Mrs. Johnson apologized profusely for not disclosing this, saying they were afraid no one would buy it if they knew the truth. Jack and I were stunned. Part of me wanted to be angry at them for hiding this, but mostly I was just scared. We debated what to do, try to reseal the room, bring in experts, move out entirely. In the end, we decided to stay and face whatever was in our home. We had a priest come bless the house and performed cleansing rituals ourselves. We unsealed the hidden room and converted it into a bright, cheerful space filled with plants and crystals. It's been about 6 months now. The negative activity has decreased, but not disappeared entirely. We still occasionally hear unexplained noises or feel that sensation of being watched. But it no longer feels malevolent, more like a curious presence observing us. I'm not sure we'll ever fully understand what happened in this house or what resides here with us, but we've made our peace with it. This is our home now, and we refuse to be driven out by fear of the unknown. Whatever secrets these old walls hold, we'll face them together. It all started on what should have been just another boring Tuesday at work. I'm a night security guard at a large office building downtown. Most nights nothing happens. I just do my rounds, watch the cameras, and count down the hours until my shift ends at 6 a.m. But this particular night was different. I arrived for my shift at 10 p.m. as usual. Everything seemed normal at first. I chatted with the day guard for a few minutes as he was leaving, then settled in at the security desk to start my night. Around midnight, I decided to do my first round of the building. I grabbed my flashlight and keycard and headed for the elevator. As I was riding up to start on the top floor, I had this weird feeling come over me, like a chill down my spine. I shook it off, figuring it was just the usual creepiness of being alone in a big empty building at night. I started my rounds on the 20th floor, shining my light down the dark hallways and checking that all the office doors were locked. Everything seemed fine, totally quiet and normal. But as I made my way down to the 19th floor, that's when things started to get strange. As soon as I stepped off the elevator, I heard what sounded like footsteps coming from down the hall. My heart started racing. I called out, "Hello, is someone there?" but got no response. I figured it must just be the building settling or something, but I was definitely on edge as I continued my round. I had just finished checking the last office on that floor when I heard it again. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, this time sounding like they were coming towards me. I spun around, shining my light down the hallway, but there was nothing there, just darkness. At this point, I was seriously freaked out. I speed-walked to the elevator, mashing the button repeatedly until the doors finally opened. As they were closing, I swear I saw a shadow move at the end of the hall. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I decided to skip the rest of my rounds and head back to the security desk. I needed to check the cameras and see if they had picked up anything. As I was reviewing the footage, my blood ran cold. There, on the feed from the 19th floor, I saw a dark figure dart across the screen. It was only for a split second, but it was unmistakable. I rewound and watched it again in slow motion. The figure looked human-shaped, but there was something off about its movements. Too fluid, almost gliding rather than walking, and its proportions seemed wrong somehow, like its limbs were too long. I sat there frozen, unsure what to do. Should I call the police? My supervisor? I didn't want to seem crazy, but I knew what I saw. As I was debating what to do, the lights in the security office suddenly flickered and went out. I fumbled for my flashlight with shaking hands. As the beam cut through the darkness, I nearly screamed. There, reflected in the black computer screen in front of me, was a face, but not a human face. It was pale and distorted, with huge black eyes and no visible mouth. I spun around, but there was nothing behind me. When I looked back at the screen, the face was gone. I ran out of that office so fast I nearly tripped over my own feet. I made it to the lobby and out the front doors, gasping for air. I called my supervisor from my cell phone, trying to explain what happened between panicked breaths. He clearly thought I was losing it, but said he'd send someone to relieve me and check things out. I waited outside, not daring to go back in that building. The relief guard showed up about 30 minutes later. I gave him a quick rundown of what happened, though I could tell from his face that he didn't believe me. He went inside to do a sweep of the building while I waited by my car, still too shaken to leave. After what felt like forever, he came back out. He said he checked every floor and didn't see anything unusual. The cameras didn't show any sign of the figure I claimed to see either. I knew how it sounded, but I swore to him that I wasn't making it up. In the end, I guess they chalked it up to me falling asleep on the job and having some kind of waking nightmare. I was written up and nearly fired, but I know what I saw was real. I ended up quitting that job soon after. I couldn't bear the thought of going back into that building, especially at night. For weeks afterwards, I had trouble sleeping, constantly feeling like I was being watched. It's been a few years now, and I've mostly put it behind me. But sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, that pale face with the black eyes burned into my mind. I don't know what I encountered that night, but I know it wasn't human. And I have a feeling that whatever it was, it's still there in that building, waiting in the shadows. I've tried to rationalize it, to convince myself it was all in my head. But deep down, I know the truth. Something impossible and terrifying happened to me that night. And the scariest part is not knowing why. Why me? Why that night? Will it ever happen again? I still avoid that part of downtown if I can help it. Just driving past that building gives me chills. I've thought about trying to research if anything like this has happened to anyone else there, but part of me is afraid of what I might find out. So I guess I'm sharing this as a warning. If you work nights, especially alone in big empty buildings, be careful. Keep your eyes open and trust your instincts. Because there are things out there in the darkness that we can't explain. Things that shouldn't exist, but somehow do. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, most days I have trouble believing it myself. But I know what I experienced was real, and I'll never forget that face in the darkness, or the way it made me feel, like I was staring into something ancient and alien and utterly malevolent. Sometimes I wonder if it would have been better not to run, to have stayed and tried to communicate with whatever it was. But then I remember those eyes, that distorted face, and I know I made the right choice. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. I still have nightmares sometimes. In them, I'm back in that building, walking those dark halls. But this time when I turn around, the figure is right there in front of me. And as those impossibly long arms reach for me, I always wake up screaming. I've tried therapy, medication, meditation, anything to try to process what happened and move on. But nothing has fully erased the memory or the fear. I guess some experiences just change you forever, leaving scars that never fully heal. So that's my story. Believe it or don't, it's up to you. But next time you're alone in a dark, quiet place and you get that feeling of being watched, just remember my words. And whatever you do, don't look behind you, because you never know what might be lurking in the shadows, waiting. I never believed in ghosts or anything supernatural, but what happened to me last year completely shattered my worldview. It all started when I moved into an old Victorian house in a quiet neighborhood. The rent was surprisingly cheap for such a beautiful place, but I didn't think much of it at the time. The first few weeks were uneventful. I was busy settling in, unpacking boxes, and getting used to my new home. But then strange things started happening. At first, it was just little things. Objects not being where I left them, cold spots in certain areas of the house, the occasional unexplained noise. I tried to rationalize it all away, blaming my forgetfulness or old pipes in the walls. But then one night, everything changed. I woke up around 3 a.m. to use the bathroom. As I walked down the hallway, I noticed a door that I'd never seen before. It was slightly ajar, and a faint bluish light was coming from inside. My heart started racing. I knew the layout of this house like the back of my hand by now, and I was certain this door hadn't been there before. I stood there frozen for what felt like hours, debating whether or not to look inside. Curiosity finally got the better of me. With trembling hands, I slowly pushed the door open. What I saw inside made my blood run cold. It was a bedroom, but unlike any I'd ever seen. The walls seemed to shimmer and move, like they were made of water. Ghostly figures floated around the room, their faces twisted in expressions of agony. In the center of the room was an old four-poster bed, and on it lay a woman in a white nightgown. She turned to look at me, and I saw that her eyes were completely black. I slammed the door shut and ran back to my room, locking the door behind me. I spent the rest of the night huddled under my blankets, trying to convince myself it was just a dream. But when morning came, the door was still there. Over the next few days, I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was just stressed, that I was seeing things. But every night, I'd wake up to strange noises coming from that room. Sometimes it was crying, other times it was screaming. Once, I swear I heard children laughing. I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to do some research on the history of the house. What I found chilled me to the bone. Apparently, back in the 1920s, a woman had murdered her 3 children in this house before taking her own life. The murders had taken place in a room that was later sealed off and hidden behind the walls. I knew I had to get out of there. I started packing my things, planning to leave first thing in the morning. But that night, things took an even more terrifying turn. I was in my bedroom, throwing clothes into a suitcase, when suddenly all the lights in the house went out. I heard that door creaking open, followed by slow, heavy footsteps coming down the hall. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I held my breath, praying whatever it was would go away. Then I heard a child's voice, soft and sweet, say, "Mommy, why won't you play with us?" I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The doorknob started to turn slowly. In a panic, I grabbed my phone and the keys to my car, then climbed out the window. I didn't even bother to grab my stuff. I just ran to my car and drove away as fast as I could. I spent the night in a motel on the outskirts of town. The next day, I went back to the house with a friend to get my things. But when we got there, the house looked different. It was run down, like it had been abandoned for years. And that extra door, it was gone. My friend thought I was crazy when I tried to explain what had happened. I ended up breaking my lease and moving in with a friend for a while. I never went back to that house, and I still have nightmares about what I saw in that room. I've tried to find information about the house's history since then, but it's like all records of it have disappeared. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, but then I remember the terror I felt that night, and I know it was real. I don't know how to explain what happened to me. Was it a ghost, a parallel dimension, some kind of time slip? All I know is that it completely changed my perception of reality. There are things in this world that we can't explain, things that defy logic and reason. And sometimes, Those things find us when we least expect it. I still can't sleep with the lights off, and I check every room in my new apartment obsessively, making sure there are no extra doors. I don't think I'll ever feel completely safe again. The experience has left me with a constant sense of unease, like at any moment I might stumble upon another impossible room or encounter something that shouldn't exist. I've tried talking to a therapist about it, but they all think I had some kind of psychotic break. Maybe they're right. Maybe it's easier to believe I went crazy for a while than to accept that there are things in this world that we can't explain. But deep down, I know what I saw. I know what I experienced. Sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet, I find myself wondering about that room. Is it still there, hidden behind the walls of that old house? Are those poor souls still trapped there, reliving their tragedy over and over again? And what would have happened if I had stepped inside? I guess I'll never know for sure. But one thing's certain, I'll never look at an old house the same way again. And if you ever find yourself in a place where things don't quite add up, where the shadows seem a little too deep and the silence a little too loud, my advice is this: get out. Get out before it's too late. Because once you've seen behind the veil, there's no going back. I still have nightmares about that woman on the bed, her black eyes staring into my soul. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear children laughing in the distance. It's been a year, and I still jump at every unexpected noise, still flinch when I see a door I don't recognize. I've tried to move on, to forget about what happened. But how do you forget something that fundamentally changes your understanding of the world? How do you go back to normal when you've seen proof that normal doesn't exist? I don't have any answers. All I have is my story, and the hope that by sharing it, maybe I can warn others. Be careful out there. The world is stranger and more dangerous than we know. And sometimes the things we can't explain are the things we should fear the most. I never thought a simple piece of furniture could terrify me so much. But after what happened that day in my basement, I don't think I'll ever look at chairs the same way again. It was just an ordinary Saturday morning. I had planned to finally tackle cleaning out the basement, a chore I'd been putting off for months. As I made my way down the creaky wooden stairs, flicking on the dim overhead light, I was greeted by the usual musty smell and cluttered mess of cardboard boxes and old junk. I got to work sorting through things, creating piles to keep, donate, or throw away. After a couple hours, I had made decent progress and decided to take a break for lunch. As I turned to head back upstairs, something caught my eye in the far corner of the basement. There, partially hidden behind some boxes, was an old wooden rocking chair I didn't recognize, which was odd because I thought I knew every item we had stored down here. It looked antique, with intricate carvings on the arms and legs. The wood was dark and weathered. Curious, I walked over to get a closer look. As I approached, a chill ran down my spine. Something about the chair just felt off. I couldn't explain it, but looking at it made me deeply uneasy. Still, I reached out to touch it, telling myself I was being silly. The moment my fingers made contact with the smooth wood, I felt a jolt, like static electricity, but stronger. I yanked my hand back in surprise. What the hell was that? My heart started racing as I stared at the chair. It was probably just the dry air down here, I reasoned. Nothing to get worked up about. I decided to move the chair out from the corner to examine it more closely. But as I grabbed the back to pull it, the strangest thing happened. It felt like the chair was resisting me, like it was heavier than it should be. or somehow rooted to the spot. I had to really strain to budge it at all. Finally, with a lot of effort, I managed to drag it out into the open space of the basement. I was breathing heavily from the exertion, way more effort than moving a chair should take. As I caught my breath, I noticed the temperature in the basement seemed to have dropped significantly. I could see my breath forming little clouds in the air. Shivering, I bent down to look at the intricate carvings more closely. They appeared to be some kind of symbols or runes, nothing I recognized. As I traced my finger along one of the carvings, I swear I felt it pulse beneath my touch. I jerked my hand back, heart pounding. This was getting too weird. I decided it was time to go back upstairs and take a break. But as I turned away from the chair, I heard a soft creak behind me. I froze. Slowly, I looked back over my shoulder. The chair was rocking gently back and forth, all on its own. I stood there paralyzed, unable to breathe or move. This couldn't be happening. Chairs don't just rock by themselves. But there it was, the aged wood creaking softly with each back and forth motion. Panic exploded in my chest. I bolted for the stairs, taking them two at a time. As I reached the top, I slammed the basement door shut behind me and leaned against it, gasping for air. What the actual fuck just happened? I paced around my kitchen, trying to calm down and make sense of things. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe there was an air current down there I hadn't noticed before, or the floorboards were uneven, causing the chair to rock when I moved it. Yeah, that had to be it. After about 15 minutes, I had mostly convinced myself I was overreacting. I was just spooked from being in the dark, musty basement too long. With a deep breath, I decided to go back down and prove to myself there was nothing to be afraid of. As I opened the basement door, icy air washed over me. The hairs on my arms stood up. Shaking off my nerves, I started down the stairs, but I only made it halfway before stopping dead in my tracks. The chair was at the bottom of the stairs, facing me. A scream caught in my throat. This was impossible. I had left it in the middle of the basement floor. There's no way it could have moved on its own. I wanted to run back upstairs and never enter the basement again. But some morbid curiosity rooted me to the spot. I found myself slowly descending the rest of the stairs, heart thundering in my chest. When I reached the bottom, I stood face to face with the chair. Up close, I could see more details in the intricate carvings. They almost seemed to be moving, shifting before my eyes. I blinked hard, convinced my eyes were playing tricks on me. That's when I noticed something even more terrifying. There were scratch marks on the floor leading from where I had left the chair to its current position at the bottom of the stairs, as if it had dragged itself across the concrete. I stumbled backwards, my back hitting the wall. This couldn't be real. I had to be dreaming or hallucinating or something. Chairs can't move on their own. They can't drag themselves across floors. But even as I tried to rationalize it, a feeling of absolute dread settled over me, because somehow I knew with certainty that this was all too real. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in fear, staring at the chair. Minutes, hours. Time seemed to lose all meaning. The only sound was my ragged breathing echoing in the stillness of the basement. Then, ever so slowly, the chair began to rock. Back and forth, the wood creaking ominously with each movement. My eyes were glued to it, unable to look away. With each forward rock, it inched closer to me. I pressed myself harder against the wall, willing myself to wake up from this nightmare. But I wasn't asleep. This was really happening. The chair was just a few feet away from me now. I could feel malevolent energy radiating from it. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just a piece of furniture. It was alive. and it wanted something from me. As it rocked forward again, now close enough that I could have reached out and touched it, I finally snapped out of my paralysis. With a strangled cry, I launched myself towards the stairs. I took them 3 at a time, certain I could feel icy fingers grasping at my ankles. I burst out of the basement door, slamming it behind me and fumbling with trembling hands to lock it. I ran through the house, not stopping until I was outside on my front lawn. I gulped in the fresh air, trying to slow my racing heart. For the rest of the day, I couldn't bring myself to go back in the house. I sat in my car, alternatively crying and trying to convince myself I had imagined the whole thing. When my wife got home from work that evening, she found me still sitting there, wild-eyed and babbling about the chair in the basement. She didn't believe me, of course. How could she? It sounded insane, even to my own ears. But she humored me and went down to the basement to check it out. She came back up a few minutes later, confusion evident on her face. "Honey, there's no chair down there," she said gently. "Are you feeling okay? Maybe you should lie down for a bit." I pushed past her and ran down to the basement, needing to see for myself. But she was right. The chair was gone. No sign it had ever been there. No scratch marks on the floor. Nothing. In the days and weeks that followed, I questioned my sanity. Had I really imagined the whole thing? But deep down, I knew what I had experienced was real. Sometimes late at night, I swear I can hear faint creaking coming from the basement, like something rocking back and forth. I avoid going down there now if I can help it, and I find myself eyeing every chair I encounter with suspicion, half expecting it to start moving on its own. I don't know what that thing in my basement was or where it came from, but I do know one thing for certain. I'll never look at a rocking chair the same way again. I never believed in ghosts or the supernatural, but what happened in my childhood home still haunts me to this day. It was the summer of 1998, and I was 12 years old. My family had just moved into an old Victorian house in a small town in upstate New York. The house was beautiful, with intricate woodwork and stained glass windows, but it also had a creepy vibe that I couldn't shake. From the first night we stayed there, I heard strange noises coming from the attic above my bedroom. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling, or maybe mice in the walls. But as the days went on, the sounds became more distinct. Footsteps pacing back and forth, objects being moved around, and sometimes what sounded like faint whispering. I told my parents about the noises, but they dismissed my concerns. They said old houses just made weird sounds sometimes, and that I was letting my imagination run wild. But I knew deep down that something wasn't right. About a week after we moved in, I woke up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. As I walked down the hallway, I noticed the pull-down ladder to the attic was down. That was strange. We never went up there, and my parents always kept it closed. As I got closer, I heard shuffling noises coming from above. My heart started racing as I approached the ladder. Every instinct told me to run back to my room, but curiosity got the better of me. I slowly climbed the creaky steps, poking my head up into the musty attic space. What I saw made my blood run cold. There was a woman standing by the small round window at the far end of the attic. She was wearing an old-fashioned white nightgown and had long dark hair that fell in tangles down her back. But the most terrifying thing was that I could see right through her. She was translucent, like a living shadow. I let out a strangled gasp, and the woman's head snapped around to look at me. Her face was gaunt and pale, with hollow black eyes that seemed to stare right through me. She started gliding towards me, her feet not touching the floor. I scrambled backwards down the ladder so fast I nearly fell. I ran to my parents' room, crying and babbling about the ghost woman in the attic. Of course, they didn't believe me. My dad grudgingly went to check the attic, but found nothing out of the ordinary. They assumed I had a vivid nightmare and sent me back to bed. But I knew what I saw was real. After that night, the activity in the house intensified. Objects would go missing only to turn up in strange places. Doors would slam shut on their own. The temperature in certain rooms would plummet for no reason. And always, there were those footsteps and whispers from the attic. I became terrified to be alone in the house. I begged my parents to move, but they refused. They thought I was just having trouble adjusting to the new house and making up stories for attention. If only they had listened to me. About a month after the first incident, things came to a head. It was a stormy night and the power had gone out. My parents were out at a dinner party, leaving me home alone with my older sister. We were huddled together in the living room, illuminated only by flickering candles. Suddenly we heard a loud crash from upstairs, like furniture being overturned. My sister reluctantly went to investigate, telling me to stay put. I sat there frozen in fear as I heard her footsteps climbing the stairs. A few moments later, I heard her blood-curdling scream. I ran upstairs and found her unconscious at the base of the attic ladder. And there, standing at the top of the steps, was the woman in white. She was more solid this time, her eyes blazing with an otherworldly light. Before I could react, she flew down the ladder towards me with impossible speed. I felt icy fingers close around my throat as she lifted me off the ground. I couldn't breathe, couldn't scream. The last thing I remember before blacking out was her face inches from mine, her mouth opening unnaturally wide to reveal rows of sharp teeth. I woke up in the hospital 2 days later. My sister had regained consciousness and called 911. She told a wild story about finding me being strangled by an invisible force. The doctors chalked it up to mass hysteria brought on by the storm and power outage. But I knew the truth. I still had bruises on my neck in the shape of long skeletal fingers. My parents finally believed us after that incident, and we moved out of the house immediately. Years later, I did some research into the history of that old Victorian. I discovered that in the early 1900s, a young woman had died there in mysterious circumstances. She was found hanged in the attic, but many believed her abusive husband was responsible. Perhaps her restless spirit was still seeking vengeance all these years later. To this day, I can't look at old houses without getting chills. I've never experienced anything paranormal since then, but the memory of that woman in white still haunts my nightmares. I know now that there are things in this world that can't be explained by logic or reason, and sometimes the ghosts of the past refuse to stay buried. I still remember the day I bought my first house on Maple Street. It was an old Victorian-style home with peeling paint and overgrown bushes, but I saw so much potential in it. The real estate agent kept emphasizing what a great deal it was, especially for this neighborhood. I should have known it was too good to be true. The first few weeks were a whirlwind of unpacking boxes and starting renovation projects. I was so excited to finally have a place to call my own. But then I started noticing odd things, little things at first, like items not being where I left them or cold spots in certain rooms. I tried to brush it off as just being forgetful or drafts in an old house. But then the incidents with the front door started. I'm a stickler for home security, always double and triple checking that I've locked up before bed. So when I came downstairs one morning to find the front door standing wide open, I was baffled. I chalked it up to forgetting in my tired state the night before and made sure to be extra vigilant going forward, except it kept happening. Every few days I'd wake up or come home to find that heavy oak door unlocked or even ajar, no matter how carefully I checked it. I started to feel like I was going crazy. Was I sleepwalking? Did I have some kind of dissociative episodes I didn't remember? I even set up a camera, but the footage never showed anything unusual. The door would just suddenly be open with no explanation. Things escalated about a month after I moved in. I was doing some work in the basement, clearing out old junk left by previous owners, when I came across a dusty rocking chair tucked away in a corner. Something about it gave me an uneasy feeling, but I figured it was just from being in the musty basement too long. I decided to bring it upstairs to refinish. It was a beautiful antique piece under all the cobwebs. That night, I had vivid nightmares of an old woman rocking in the chair, staring at me with milky white eyes. I woke up in a cold sweat, heart pounding. As I got up to get some water, I heard a faint creaking sound coming from downstairs. Telling myself it was just the house settling, I crept down the stairs and froze. The rocking chair was moving, all on its own, slowly rocking back and forth in the pale moonlight streaming through the window. I stood there paralyzed, unable to breathe or move or even think. After what felt like an eternity, the rocking slowed to a stop. I bolted back upstairs and didn't sleep a wink that night. The next day, I did some research on the house's history. It turned out the previous longtime owner had been an elderly widow named Eleanor Martin. She had lived in the house for over 50 years before passing away in that very rocking chair. A chill ran down my spine as I read the old newspaper clipping. I seriously considered selling the house and cutting my losses, but something held me back, maybe stubbornness, maybe curiosity. I decided to stay, at least for a while longer. I moved the rocking chair to the living room, feeling like that's where it belonged. For the next week, nothing out of the ordinary happened. The door stayed locked. The chair didn't move. I started to relax, thinking maybe it had all been in my head. But then came the night that changed everything. I was up late watching TV when I heard that familiar creaking sound. Slowly, I turned to look at the rocking chair. And there she was, a translucent figure of an elderly woman, rocking gently back and forth. I could see right through her to the fabric of the chair. Strangely, I didn't feel afraid. There was a sense of peace about her presence. We looked at each other for a long moment, a silent understanding passing between us. Then she smiled, just slightly, and faded away. From that night on, things were different in the house. The door stopped coming unlocked. The cold spots and odd occurrences ceased. But every so often, usually when I'm feeling stressed or lonely, I'll hear the soft creak of the rocking chair. And I know Eleanor is there, watching over her beloved home. I've made peace with sharing my house with Eleanor's spirit. In a way, it's comforting to know I'm not alone here. I've even started talking to her sometimes, telling her about my day or asking her opinion on my renovation plans. I like to think she approves of how I'm taking care of the place. Sometimes friends ask if I ever get spooked living in such an old house by myself. I just smile and say, I have a guardian angel looking out for me. If only they knew how true that was. It's been 5 years now since I moved in, and I can't imagine living anywhere else. This house, with all its quirks and history, has become my home in every sense of the word, and Eleanor has become like family, a slightly unconventional spectral family member, but family nonetheless. I've learned so much about the house's history and Eleanor's life. She was a pillar of the community, known for her kindness and generosity. In a way, I feel like I'm carrying on her legacy by restoring the house to its former glory and making it a warm, welcoming place once again. There are still moments that give me pause, a whisper of movement caught in the corner of my eye, the sensation of being watched when I'm alone. But it's no longer frightening. It's just part of life on Maple Street. I often wonder what Eleanor thinks of the modern world, of all the changes I've made to her home. Does she approve of the new paint colors? Is she baffled by the smart home technology I've installed? I like to imagine her shaking her head in amusement at my fumbling attempts to fix things around the house. As I sit here writing this, I can hear the gentle creaking of the rocking chair in the next room. It's a sound that once filled me with terror, but now brings a sense of comfort. It's a reminder that home isn't just about the physical structure, but the memories and connections we make within its walls. To anyone reading this who might be dealing with their own supernatural experiences, I say this: sometimes the unknown isn't something to be feared, but embraced. Eleanor could have been a malevolent presence, driving me from the house in terror. Instead, she's become a silent guardian, a link to the past, and in her own way, a friend. I know not everyone will understand or believe my story. That's okay. I'm not sure I would have believed it myself if I hadn't lived through it. But I know what I've experienced, and I wouldn't change it for anything. So here's to you, Eleanor. Thank you for sharing your home with me, for teaching me that family can come in the most unexpected forms. And thank you for always remembering to lock the front door. It was a crisp autumn morning when I arrived at my new job at Evergreen Assisted Living. I had just graduated with my nursing degree and was excited to start my career caring for the elderly. The facility was nestled in a quiet, wooded area on the outskirts of town. As I walked up the stone path to the entrance, fallen leaves crunched under my feet. The administrator, Julie, greeted me warmly and gave me a tour of the building. Everything seemed normal at first. Cozy common areas, a dining hall, nurses' station. But as we walked down the resident hallway, I felt an odd chill. The light seemed to flicker slightly. I brushed it off as first-day jitters. Julie introduced me to some of the staff and residents. Most were friendly, if a bit confused at times, but there was one resident who immediately caught my attention. His name was Nolan, and he was sitting alone in the corner of the activity room, staring blankly out the window. When Julie tried to introduce us, Nolan didn't respond or even look our way. She explained that he had severe dementia and rarely interacted with anyone anymore. Something about him unsettled me, but I couldn't put my finger on why. As the day went on, I started to get into the routine, helping residents with meals, passing out medications, assisting with daily care. But I kept finding myself glancing over at Nolan. He barely moved from his spot by the window all day. Around lunchtime, I was helping in the dining room when I heard a commotion down the hall. I rushed over to find Nolan's roommate, Bill, in a state of panic. He was babbling incoherently and pointing at Nolan's empty bed. The staff tried to calm him down, but he kept insisting that he was coming for him. We assumed Bill was just having an episode related to his dementia. But as I helped get him settled, he grabbed my arm and looked me in the eyes with surprising lucidity. "Be careful," he said in a raspy whisper. "He's not what he seems." A chill ran down my spine. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling as I continued my rounds that afternoon, but strange little things kept happening. Lights would flicker when I walked past Nolan. The room would suddenly feel ice cold, At one point, I could have sworn I saw his reflection in a mirror when he wasn't anywhere nearby. As evening approached, I was helping get residents ready for dinner when I realized I hadn't seen Nolan in a while. I asked another nurse about it, and she said he usually skipped dinner and stayed in his room. I decided to check on him, just to be safe. I knocked on his door but got no response. When I entered, the room was pitch black and freezing cold. I fumbled for the light switch, my heart racing. When the lights flickered on, I gasped. Nolan was standing perfectly still in the corner, facing the wall. I called out to him, but he didn't move a muscle. As I cautiously approached, I noticed something odd about his shadow on the wall. It seemed to be moving independently, writhing and stretching in impossible ways. I blinked hard, sure I must be seeing things. Suddenly, Nolan's head snapped around 180 degrees to face me. His eyes were pitch black, and his mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin filled with razor-sharp teeth. I stumbled backward in shock, my scream caught in my throat. In an instant, Nolan was directly in front of me, moving faster than humanly possible. Up close, I could see that his skin had a grayish, almost translucent quality. He reeked of decay. I was paralyzed with fear as he leaned in close to my face. In a low, guttural voice that sounded nothing like the frail old man I'd seen earlier, he growled, "Fresh meat." His jaw unhinged like a snake, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. I snapped out of my paralysis and ran for my life, slamming the door behind me. I sprinted down the hall, yelling for help, but when other staff members arrived, Nolan was back in his usual spot by the window, looking frail and confused. They clearly thought I was having some kind of breakdown. How could I explain what I'd seen? The rest of my shift was a blur. I was jumpy and on edge, flinching at every sound. I could feel Nolan's eyes on me whenever I was in the same room. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of that terrifying grin when no one else was looking. As I was preparing to leave for the night, Julie pulled me aside. She said that while she appreciated my enthusiasm, I needed to be more careful about upsetting the residents. Apparently, Nolan's family had complained that I'd been harassing him. I tried to protest, to explain what had happened, but Julie just gave me a stern look and told me to go home and get some rest. I sat in my car for a long time before I could bring myself to drive home. I kept replaying the events in my mind, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Was I losing my mind? Had the stress of the new job caused me to hallucinate? But deep down, I knew what I'd seen was real. The pure evil I'd glimpsed in Nolan's eyes. It wasn't something my mind could have invented. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that horrifying grin. I kept imagining Nolan somehow finding me, appearing in my room with those black eyes and razor teeth. The next morning, I called in sick. I couldn't bear the thought of going back there, of facing Nolan again. Julie sounded annoyed, but said she'd find someone to cover my shift. As I hung up, I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but that relief was short-lived. Later that day, I got a call from the police. There had been a tragic incident at Evergreen. They wouldn't give me details over the phone, but asked me to come in for questioning. When I arrived at the station, they told me the awful truth. Bill, Nolan's roommate, had been found dead in his bed that morning. The cause was officially listed as natural causes, but there were inconsistencies. His body showed signs of extreme terror, and there were unexplained lacerations all over his torso. The police had a lot of questions. Where was I last night? Did I notice anything unusual during my shift? Did Bill seem afraid of anyone? I told them everything I could, leaving out the impossible things I'd seen. I knew they'd never believe me. After hours of questioning, they finally let me go. They said I wasn't a suspect, but asked me not to leave town. As I walked out of the station in a daze, my phone buzzed with a text. It was from an unknown number. "I know what you saw. Meet me at Oakwood Cemetery tonight at midnight if you want answers. Come alone." I debated for hours whether to go. It was clearly a bad idea to meet a stranger in a cemetery at night, but I was desperate for answers, for some confirmation that I wasn't crazy. As the witching hour approached, I found myself driving to Oakwood Cemetery, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. The old iron gates creaked as I pushed them open. Moonlight filtered through the trees, casting eerie shadows across the gravestones. I wandered through the rows of monuments, jumping at every snapping twig. Just as I was about to give up and leave, I saw a figure standing by an ancient mausoleum. As I got closer, I recognized her as one of the nurses from Evergreen. "I'm glad you came," she said in a hushed voice. "I saw what happened with Nolan, too. I've been working there for years, and I've seen things, terrible things." She went on to tell me a story that chilled me to the bone. Nolan wasn't human, had never been human. He was some kind of ancient, malevolent entity that fed on fear and suffering. He would move from place to place, taking on the guise of a helpless old man, to infiltrate care homes and prey on the vulnerable. The nurse had been trying to warn people for years, but no one believed her. Those who got too close to the truth had a habit of disappearing or dying under mysterious circumstances. She was terrified, but felt compelled to keep working there to try to protect people. As she spoke, the temperature suddenly plummeted. The air filled with an oppressive, evil presence. We both turned to see a familiar figure standing among the gravestones, grinning that impossible grin. "Run!" the nurse screamed. We took off, sprinting through the cemetery. I could hear inhuman snarling and the sound of something fast approaching behind us. Just as we reached the gates, I heard the nurse cry out. I glanced back to see her being dragged into the shadows by a mass of writhing darkness. I ran to my car and sped away, my heart pounding. I drove for hours, too terrified to stop. When the sun finally rose, I was 3 states away. I've been on the run ever since, never staying in one place for long. I don't know if Nolan is still at Evergreen or if he's moved on to another facility to continue his reign of terror. All I know is that true evil exists in this world, hiding in plain sight, and once you've seen it, you can never unsee it. So if you're working in a nursing home and you notice a resident who never seems to eat, who makes the lights flicker, who fills you with inexplicable dread, don't ignore your instincts. Run as far and as fast as you can before it's too late. We arrived on Friday evening as the sun was setting. The owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Thompson, greeted us warmly and gave us a quick tour of the house. It was cozy and rustic, with creaky wooden floors and antique furniture. Mrs. Thompson showed us the kitchen, living room, and bathroom on the first floor, then led us upstairs to see the bedrooms. "This is the master bedroom where you'll be staying," she said, opening the door to a spacious room with a 4-poster bed. "And this is the guest room across the hall." She gestured to another door, but didn't open it. As we were about to head back downstairs, I noticed a third door at the end of the hallway. "What's in there?" I asked curiously. Mrs. Thompson's smile faltered for just a moment. "Oh, that's just a storage room. Nothing interesting in there," she said quickly. "Now, let me show you how to work the fireplace downstairs." I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back, I should have noticed how her demeanor changed when I asked about that room. If only I had known what was to come. That night, my girlfriend and I had a lovely dinner and cuddled by the fire. We went to bed feeling relaxed and content. But around 3 a.m., I woke up suddenly, my heart racing. I could have sworn I heard footsteps in the hallway outside our room. I lay there frozen, straining my ears. The footsteps seemed to pace back and forth, back and forth. They were soft but distinctive. I nudged my girlfriend, but she was fast asleep. After a few minutes, the footsteps faded away. I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling, or my imagination playing tricks on me. The next morning over breakfast, I casually asked my girlfriend if she had heard anything strange during the night. She shook her head. I slept like a rock. This place is so peaceful. I decided not to mention the footsteps. We spent a pleasant day hiking in the nearby woods and having a picnic by a stream. But as evening approached and we returned to the house, I felt a growing sense of unease that I couldn't explain. That night, I woke up again around the same time. This time, I distinctly heard a door creaking open and then closing. My blood ran cold. I sat up in bed, my eyes straining in the darkness. The bedroom door was still closed, but I could hear those soft footsteps again, pacing the hallway. I shook my girlfriend awake. "Do you hear that?" I whispered urgently. She listened for a moment, then nodded, her eyes wide. "What is that?" she whispered back. Gathering my courage, I got out of bed and crept to the door. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. I took a deep breath and yanked the door open. The hallway was empty and silent. The guest room door was closed, as was the door to the mysterious storage room at the end of the hall. I walked up and down the hallway, my bare feet cold on the wooden floor. There was no sign of anyone or anything that could have made those sounds. When I returned to bed, my girlfriend was visibly shaken. "Maybe it was just the wind," she suggested, but I could tell she didn't believe it. Neither of us slept much for the rest of the night. In the morning, we decided to cut our trip short and head back to the city. As we were packing up our things, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Just before we left, I decided to take one last look around upstairs. I don't know what compelled me, but I found myself drawn to that closed door at the end of the hallway. My hand reached out for the doorknob almost of its own accord. To my surprise, it turned easily. The door swung open with a familiar creak. I gasped. The room was completely empty. No furniture, no boxes, nothing. But what shocked me were the footprints visible in the thick layer of dust on the floor. They formed a clear path pacing back and forth, exactly like the footsteps I had heard in the night. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. At that moment, Mrs. Thompson appeared at the bottom of the stairs. "Is everything all right?" she called up. I quickly shut the door and composed myself. "Yes, everything's fine," I managed to reply. "We're just leaving now." As we drove away, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen. I wanted to ask Mrs. Thompson about the room, about the footprints, about the noises in the night. But something held me back. Maybe it was fear of confirming my suspicions, or maybe I just didn't want to know the truth. In the weeks that followed, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe there was a logical explanation for everything. But deep down, I knew that we had encountered something that defied explanation. I've done some research since then, trying to find out more about the history of that house. I haven't found much, but there are whispers of tragedy. A young woman who disappeared decades ago, never to be seen again. Some say she still wanders the halls of her old home, unable to find peace. I don't know if I believe in ghosts, but I do know that there are things in this world that we can't explain. And sometimes it's better not to try. We never went back to that cottage, and I doubt we ever will. But on quiet nights, when the wind whistles outside my window, I sometimes think I hear the echo of those footsteps, pacing back and forth, in a room that should be empty. I've never shared this story before now. Part of me still wonders if I imagined it all. But another part of me knows that what we experienced was all too real. Whatever was in that house, whatever presence lingered in that empty room, it changed me forever. I no longer scoff at ghost stories or dismiss tales of the supernatural, because now I know that sometimes the line between our world and the next is thinner than we'd like to believe. I often find myself thinking about that room, about the footprints in the dust. What was the story behind them? Who was the spirit that couldn't find rest? And why did it choose to reveal itself to us? These questions haunt me, much like the footsteps that haunted that hallway. I've tried to find answers, but the more I search, the more elusive they become. Perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, serving as a reminder that there's more to our world than what we can see and touch. Since that weekend, I've become more attuned to the unexplainable. I notice things I never did before, the way shadows sometimes move when they shouldn't, the whispers that seem to come from empty rooms, the feeling of being watched when I'm alone. It's as if that experience opened my eyes to a whole other layer of reality that had always been there, just beyond my perception. My girlfriend and I don't talk about it much anymore. I think we both prefer to pretend it never happened. But sometimes I catch her looking over her shoulder in dark rooms or startling at unexpected noises. I know she feels it too. That lingering sense that we brushed up against something beyond our understanding. I've often wondered what would have happened if we had stayed another night. Would the presence have revealed itself more fully? Or would it have remained just out of sight, leaving us to question our sanity? Part of me is glad we left when we did, but another part wishes we had stayed to unravel the mystery. There are nights when I lie awake, replaying every detail of that weekend in my mind. The creak of the door, the soft footsteps, the dusty footprints, they're all etched into my memory with perfect clarity. And each time I revisit those memories, I notice something new, some small detail that I missed before. I've thought about contacting Mrs. Thompson, about asking her what she knows about the house and its history. But something always stops me. Maybe it's fear, or maybe it's the realization that some truths are better left uncovered. So I'm left with this story, this experience that defies explanation. It sits in the back of my mind, a constant reminder that the world is stranger and more mysterious than we often allow ourselves to believe. And while part of me wishes I could forget it all and go back to seeing the world as I did before, another part of me is grateful for the experience. Because now I know that there's more to life than what we can see and touch. There are mysteries out there waiting to be discovered. And while they may frighten us, they also remind us of the wonder and complexity of existence. So if you ever find yourself in an old house and you hear unexplained footsteps in the night or see a door that seems to open on its own, don't be too quick to dismiss it. You might just be witnessing a glimpse of something beyond our understanding. And who knows, maybe someday we'll unlock the secrets of that ghostly realm that exists just beyond the veil of our perception. Until then, I'll keep telling my story, hoping that maybe someone out there has had a similar experience. Because in sharing these tales, We remind ourselves that there's still magic and mystery in the world, and sometimes that's exactly what we need to remember. I was always an early riser, loving nothing more than hopping on my bike at dawn to catch the first rays of sunlight. As an avid cyclist, I'd been riding the same route for years, a scenic 20-mile loop through winding country roads and quaint neighborhoods on the outskirts of town. It had become such a familiar ritual that I could probably navigate it with my eyes closed. About 6 months ago, I decided to start recording my rides. Nothing fancy, just a small action camera mounted to my helmet to capture the scenery and track my progress. I'd upload the footage later and review it, always looking for ways to improve my form or shave a few seconds off my time. That particular morning started like any other. The air was crisp and cool as I set out, my breath visible in little puffs as I pedaled. The streets were mostly empty at that hour, just a few early commuters and the occasional delivery truck. As I made my way out of the suburbs and onto the rural roads, I settled into a comfortable rhythm, enjoying the solitude and the gradually brightening sky. It wasn't until I reached the halfway point of my ride that I noticed anything unusual. I was cruising down a long straightaway lined with old oak trees, their gnarled branches creating a canopy overhead. As I passed a parked car, something in its side mirror caught my eye, a flicker of movement that seemed out of place. I glanced back over my shoulder, but the road behind me was empty. Shrugging it off, I continued on. But as I rode past the next parked vehicle, I saw it again in the reflection, a dark, indistinct shape that appeared to be moving right along with me. My heart rate, already elevated from exertion, ticked up a notch. I told myself I was just seeing things, maybe a trick of the light or my own shadow. But I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. As I pedaled on, I found myself obsessively checking every reflective surface I passed. Car windows, puddles on the road, even the polished granite of a roadside monument. And in each one, for just a split second, I caught a glimpse of that same shadowy figure. The really unsettling part was how close it seemed to be. In some of the reflections, it looked like it was right behind me, almost as if it were perched on the back of my bike. But every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. By the time I made it back home, I was thoroughly rattled. I tried to convince myself that I was just tired, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But as I uploaded the footage from my ride, a part of me dreaded what I might see. At first glance, everything looked normal, just me pedaling along empty roads as the sun slowly rose. But then I noticed something. In the edges of the frame, in reflections and shadows, there were anomalies, shapes and movements that didn't match up with what should have been there. I spent hours poring over that footage, going through it frame by frame. And the more I looked, the more convinced I became that something had been following me that morning. Something that didn't want to be seen directly, but couldn't quite hide its presence entirely. Desperate for answers, I turned to cycling forums online. I was hesitant to share my full experience, worried people would think I was crazy. So I made a vague post asking if anyone else had ever felt like they were being followed while out on a solo ride. To my shock, the responses came pouring in. Dozens of cyclists from all over the world described similar experiences, the feeling of being watched, glimpses of shadowy figures in reflections, the sense that something was right behind them, even when the road was empty. One comment in particular sent chills down my spine. A woman in Australia wrote about how she'd been filming her rides for months, trying to capture evidence of whatever was stalking her. She said she'd finally managed to get a clear shot of it in her rear-view mirror, but when she tried to show the footage to her husband, the file was corrupted. When she checked her camera, all of her recordings from the past several weeks had been wiped clean. As I read story after story, I felt a mix of relief and terror. I wasn't going crazy. This was a real phenomenon that others had experienced. But that also meant that whatever I'd encountered out there was real too. Some of the forum members had theories. A few thought it was some kind of interdimensional being that was only partially visible in our reality. Others suggested it might be the ghost of a cyclist who'd died on the road. One guy was convinced it was evidence of a government conspiracy involving invisible drones. I didn't know what to believe. All I knew was that I couldn't bring myself to go out for my usual morning ride anymore. I tried a few times, but every shadow and reflection made me flinch. I kept imagining that thing right behind me, reaching out. After a few weeks, I worked up the courage to review my helmet cam footage again. This time, I noticed something I'd missed before. In one of the frames reflected in a store window I'd passed, I could make out a face. It was blurry and distorted, but unmistakably there. Gray skin, hollow eyes, mouth opened in a silent scream. I nearly fell out of my chair. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely use the mouse to close the video player. I haven't looked at that footage since. It's been months now, and I still haven't been able to get back on my bike. I've tried riding at different times of day, on different routes, but I can't shake the feeling of being watched, followed. Sometimes I think I catch glimpses of that figure out of the corner of my eye, even when I'm not riding. In shop windows as I walk down the street, in the rearview mirror of my car, in the reflection on my computer screen late at night. I don't know what it wants or why it chose to reveal itself to me that day. All I know is that I'll never look at a reflection the same way again, and I can't help but wonder, how long had it been there, silently trailing behind me, before I finally noticed? The truly terrifying thought is this: what if we're all being followed by something like that, just out of sight? What if all it takes is the right angle, the right reflection, for us to suddenly see what's been there all along? I still have that footage saved, buried in an encrypted folder on an old hard drive. Part of me wants to delete it and try to forget this whole thing ever happened. But another part of me thinks that someday I might need it. As proof, as a warning, I'm not sure. All I know is that I can't bring myself to get rid of it entirely. So I guess I'm sharing this as a warning to other cyclists out there. Be careful what you might see in those passing reflections. And if you ever feel like something's following you on an empty road, well, maybe it is. I used to love the solitude of those early morning rides. Now I can't stand to be alone, because I know that even when I think I'm by myself, I'm not. That thing is out there, always watching, always following, and I'm afraid that one of these days it's going to do more than just watch. I was out on one of my usual long-distance cycling routes, enjoying the solitude of the open road. As an avid cyclist, I often seek out these isolated stretches where I can clear my mind and push my physical limits. It was a crisp autumn morning, the kind where your breath fogs up in front of you and the chill bites at your fingertips. I had been riding for a couple of hours already, the rhythmic spinning of my pedals and the crunch of gravel under my tires, the only sounds breaking the silence. The sun was just starting to peek over the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. I was making good time, feeling strong despite the challenging terrain. As I rounded a bend in the road, something caught my eye up ahead. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I got closer, I could make out the distinct shape of a car pulled over on the shoulder. It wasn't uncommon to see the occasional broken-down vehicle out here, but something about this one felt off. The car was angled awkwardly, half on the road and half in the ditch. As I approached, I slowed my pace, squinting to get a better look. It was an older model sedan, dark blue, with what looked like some front-end damage. My first thought was that someone had run off the road and needed help. I pulled up alongside the vehicle, my heart rate picking up a bit. The windows were foggy, making it hard to see inside. I unclipped from my pedals and dismounted, leaning my bike against a nearby tree. As I approached the driver's side, I could make out a figure inside. It was a woman, her face pressed against the glass. "Hello?" I called out, tapping lightly on the window. "Are you all right? Do you need help?" The woman's head snapped towards me, her eyes wide with panic. She began frantically gesturing and mouthing words I couldn't make out. I tried the door handle, but it was locked. "I can't hear you," I shouted, motioning for her to roll down the window. She shook her head violently, then pointed to the back seat. That's when I noticed two small shapes huddled there. Children. The woman's lips were moving rapidly now, and though I couldn't hear her, I could read the desperation in her eyes. She kept pointing to the kids, then to me, then making a running motion with her fingers. My mind was racing. Were they in danger? Was someone after them? I fumbled for my phone, ready to call for help, when the woman's eyes went wide. She pressed her palms flat against the glass, shaking her head frantically. "No phone," I managed to make out as she mouthed the words emphatically. I hesitated, torn between wanting to help and the growing sense that something was very, very wrong here. The woman was becoming more agitated, her movements more frenzied. She kept pointing to the back seat, to the children, then to me. "Take them." I finally understood what she was trying to say. "Please take my girls." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. I looked more closely at the back seat, trying to get a better view of the children. But the fog on the windows and the dim light made it hard to see clearly. "Okay," I said, nodding to show I understood. "I'll help. Just unlock the doors." The woman's face flooded with relief. She nodded, then turned to reach for something. I moved to the rear door, my hand hovering over the handle, ready to open it the moment I heard the lock click. But the sound never came. I waited a few seconds, then looked back to the driver's window. The woman was gone. I blinked hard, sure I must be seeing things. I pressed my face to the glass, cupping my hands around my eyes to block out the glare. The car was empty. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. This couldn't be happening. I had just seen them, just moments ago. I circled the car, checking every window, but there was no sign of the woman or the children. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone and dialed emergency services. As I waited for them to pick up, I noticed something I hadn't before. The car's license plate was bent and caked with mud, but I could just make out the numbers. They seemed oddly familiar. The operator's voice snapped me back to reality. I quickly explained the situation, giving them my location and a description of the car. The woman on the other end of the line was silent for a moment after I finished. "Sir," she said slowly, "are you sure about the license plate number you just gave me?" "Yes," I replied, double-checking to be certain. "Why? What's wrong?" There was another pause before she continued. "We received a report of a fatal accident involving a vehicle matching that description yesterday evening. A woman and her 2 daughters. They didn't survive the crash." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. I felt lightheaded, my vision blurring at the edges. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of mistake. That's not possible, I stammered. I just saw them. The woman was asking for help. Her children were in the back seat. I swear they were right here. The operator's voice was gentle but firm. Sir, I understand this must be very confusing and upsetting. I'm dispatching a unit to your location now. Please stay where you are and try to remain calm. I mumbled an agreement and ended the call, my mind reeling. I turned back to the car, half expecting it to have vanished like its occupants. But it was still there, silent and empty. As I waited for the police to arrive, I couldn't shake the image of the woman's desperate face from my mind. The way she had pleaded with me to save her children, it had felt so real, so urgent. How could it have been a hallucination? The sound of approaching sirens pulled me from my thoughts. 2 police cars pulled up, followed closely by an ambulance. The officers approached cautiously, hands near their weapons as they surveyed the scene. I raised my hands instinctively, suddenly aware of how crazy my story must sound. I swear I'm not making this up, I blurted out as they neared. There was a woman and 2 kids in that car. I saw them. The older of the 2 officers held up a hand to quiet me. Take it easy, sir. We're just here to check things out. Can you tell us exactly what happened? I recounted the events as clearly as I could, trying not to leave out any details. The officers listened patiently, exchanging glances occasionally. When I finished, the younger one walked over to examine the car while his partner continued to question me. Have you been drinking or taking any medications? He asked, his tone professional but skeptical. I shook my head emphatically. No, nothing like that. I'm just out for my usual morning ride. I don't understand what's happening. The officer nodded, making a note in his pad. And you're certain about what you saw? The woman, the children? You actually saw them inside the vehicle? Yes, I insisted. I know how it sounds, but I swear it's true. She was begging me to help her daughters. It was so real. My voice trailed off as the younger officer returned from inspecting the car. He spoke quietly to his partner, but I caught fragments of their conversation. No signs of recent occupancy, matches the description from yesterday's accident. Tow truck on the way. The older officer turned back to me, his expression a mix of concern and disbelief. Sir, I'm going to level with you. The vehicle you've reported matches one involved in a fatal accident yesterday evening, about 20 miles from here. A woman and her 2 young daughters were killed instantly when their car went off the road and hit a tree. I felt the blood drain from my face. But how is that possible? I saw them. I talked to her. The officer sighed. I can't explain what you think you saw, but I can tell you with certainty that no one has been in that car since the accident. We're going to need you to come down to the station to give a formal statement. As they led me to one of the patrol cars, I looked back at the abandoned vehicle. For just a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of movement behind the foggy windows. A woman's face pressed against the glass, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and gratitude. I blinked, and it was gone. The ride to the police station was a blur. I answered their questions as best I could, but I could tell they didn't believe me. How could they? I barely believed it myself. After hours of questioning and a breath test that confirmed I hadn't been drinking, they finally let me go with a warning to seek medical attention if I experienced any more unusual episodes. I rode home in a daze, my mind replaying the events of the morning over and over. As I pulled into my driveway, a thought struck me. I rushed to my computer and searched for news reports of yesterday's accident. There it was, complete with a photo of the wrecked car, the same car I had seen on the roadside. The article mentioned the victims, Lisa Callahan, 35, and her daughters Emma, 8, and Sophia, 6. They had been on their way to visit Lisa's sister when the accident occurred. As I stared at their smiling faces in the accompanying family photo, a chill ran through me. I recognized them. The woman who had pleaded for help, the small shapes I had glimpsed in the back seat. It was them. To this day, I can't explain what happened on that lonely stretch of road. Was it a ghost, a hallucination, some kind of time slip? I don't know. But I do know that every time I close my eyes, I see that woman's desperate face, begging me to save her children. And I wonder if, somehow, in some way I can't understand, I was meant to be there. If, by witnessing their final moments, I had given them some kind of peace. I still ride that route sometimes, always slowing as I pass the spot where I saw the car. It's never there, of course. But sometimes, just as the sun is coming up and the morning mist is thick on the ground, I swear I can hear a faint voice on the wind. "Take them," it whispers. "Please, take my girls." And I pedal faster, my heart racing, torn between the urge to flee and the nagging feeling that I've left something unfinished behind me. The day started out beautifully. Clear blue skies, a light breeze, and temperatures in the mid-60s. Ideal conditions for a long ride. I arrived at the trailhead early, around 7 a.m., wanting to beat the crowds and have the trail mostly to myself. As I unloaded my bike and gear from my car, I noticed there were only a couple other vehicles in the parking lot. Good, I thought to myself. I'll have some peace and quiet out there. I did a quick check of my bike, making sure the tires were properly inflated and everything was in working order. I filled up my hydration pack, stashed some energy bars in my pack, and slathered on some sunscreen. With my helmet securely fastened, I set off down the trail, my excitement building as I began pedaling into the wilderness. The first few miles were absolutely incredible. The trail snaked through towering pine forests, across babbling brooks, and up along ridge lines with sweeping vistas of the surrounding mountains. My legs burned pleasantly as I powered up the steep inclines, and I felt alive as I navigated the technical rocky sections on the descents. This was what I lived for, just me, my bike, and nature in all its raw beauty. About an hour into the ride, I rounded a bend and caught a glimpse of another cyclist up ahead. He was moving slowly, almost leisurely, on what looked like a very old-fashioned bicycle. As I got closer, I could see it was one of those vintage bikes from many decades ago, with skinny tires and a rigid frame totally unsuited for this kind of terrain. The rider was dressed oddly too, in what looked like clothes from another era. Tweed jacket, woolen pants, leather boots. Definitely not typical mountain biking attire. I called out a friendly, "On your left," as I prepared to pass him. But as I drew even with the strange cyclist, a chill ran down my spine. His skin was deathly pale, almost gray, and his eyes, there was just something off about them. Vacant, glassy, unseeing. He didn't acknowledge me at all as I rode by, just kept pedaling at that eerily slow pace, staring straight ahead. Shaken, I picked up my pace, wanting to put some distance between myself and the unnerving stranger. I told myself I was being silly. He was probably just some eccentric local out for a casual ride. Nothing to worry about. But I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. I rode hard for the next several miles, tackling some of the most challenging sections of the trail. My legs were burning and my lungs heaving as I crested a particularly brutal climb. I stopped at the top to catch my breath and take in the view. As I was gulping water from my hydration pack, movement in my peripheral vision caught my attention. I turned and felt my blood run cold. There, about 50 yards away through a gap in the trees, was the strange cyclist. He was just standing there, perfectly still, staring right at me with those lifeless eyes. But that was impossible. There was no way he could have gotten ahead of me, especially on that ancient bike. The only way up was the trail I'd just climbed. Thoroughly creeped out now, I jumped back on my bike and took off down the other side of the ridge as fast as I dared. My heart was pounding, and not just from the exertion. I rode recklessly, taking chances on the technical descents that I normally wouldn't. I just wanted to get back to my car and off this trail as quickly as possible. After bombing downhill for what felt like forever, I finally started to relax a bit. Surely I'd left the weirdo far behind by now. I slowed my pace and tried to get my breathing under control. That's when I heard it, the soft creak of rusty gears turning, coming from somewhere behind me. I whipped my head around, and there he was again, materializing out of the shadows of the forest like a ghostly apparition. Still moving at that unnaturally slow pace, but somehow keeping up with me no matter how fast I rode. His dead eyes bored into me as he followed, always maintaining the same distance. Panic exploded in my chest. This defied all logic. I mashed the pedals with everything I had, no longer caring about the trail, just desperate to get away. Branches whipped at my face as I veered off the path, searching for any way to lose my pursuer. In my blind terror, I failed to see the protruding tree root directly in my path. My front wheel caught it, and I went flying over the handlebars, tumbling painfully down a steep embankment. I came to rest in a tangle of brush, the wind knocked out of me. As I lay there gasping for air, I became aware of the sound of tires crunching on gravel growing closer. Ignoring the pain shooting through my battered body, I scrambled to my feet and limped as fast as I could through the underbrush. I didn't dare look back, certain that if I did, I would see that pale, emotionless face right behind me. I crashed through the woods with no sense of direction, driven purely by primitive fear. Just when I thought my legs would give out, I burst out of the tree line into a small clearing. To my immense relief, I saw a park ranger station about 100 yards away. Summoning my last reserves of energy, I sprinted toward it, screaming for help. The door flew open, and a startled-looking ranger emerged, hand on his sidearm. "What's wrong? Are you hurt?" he asked as I stumbled up to him. Between ragged breaths, I poured out my terrifying story. The strange, old-fashioned cyclist, his inexplicable appearances, the relentless pursuit. The ranger's face grew increasingly grim as I spoke. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You're not the first person to report something like this on that trail. About 30 years ago, before my time here, there was a cyclist who went missing in that area. They never found him or his bike. Since then, we occasionally get hikers or bikers coming in with stories similar to yours, always describing the same old-fashioned bicycle and rider." A chill ran through me. What do you think it means?" I asked. The ranger shook his head. "I don't rightly know. Some say it's just an urban legend that's taken on a life of its own. Others think there's something more supernatural at work. All I know is that section of trail has a bad reputation among us rangers. We try to steer folks away from it when we can." He offered to drive me back to my car, which I gratefully accepted. As we bounced along the park road in his truck, I kept replaying the events in my mind, trying to make sense of what had happened. Part of me wanted to dismiss it all as an overactive imagination fueled by exhaustion, but I knew deep down that what I'd experienced was all too real. We reached the parking lot, and I was relieved to see my car still there, untouched. As I gathered my things from the ranger's truck, he placed a hand on my shoulder. "Listen," he said seriously. "My advice would be to stay away from that trail from now on. Whatever's out there, well, it's probably best left alone. Take care of yourself." I nodded shakily and thanked him for his help. As I drove home, my hands trembling slightly on the steering wheel, I knew with absolute certainty that I would never return to that trail again. The memory of those soulless eyes following me would haunt my dreams for years to come. To this day, I can't fully explain what happened to me out there in the woods. Was it truly a ghost, the restless spirit of a long-dead cyclist, or something even stranger that defies rational explanation? All I know is that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, and sometimes it's best not to go looking for adventure in dark and lonely places. You never know what might be looking back. As we pulled out of the station, I gazed out the window at the city lights fading into the distance. The gentle hum of the engine and the rhythmic motion of the bus soon lulled me into a peaceful daze. I must have dozed off for a bit because when I opened my eyes again, we were on a dark, lonely stretch of highway surrounded by dense forest on both sides. That's when I first noticed her. An elderly woman had taken the seat directly behind me while I was sleeping. I hadn't heard her board the bus or sit down, which struck me as odd. She was hunched over, her face mostly obscured by a tattered shawl, but I could make out wisps of stringy gray hair and wrinkled, liver-spotted hands. Something about her presence made me deeply uneasy, though I couldn't put my finger on why. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself I was just groggy and disoriented from my nap, but as the minutes ticked by, my sense of unease only grew. The old woman was muttering to herself in a low, raspy voice. I couldn't make out any words, just an eerie, continuous mumbling. Every now and then, she would let out a wheezing chuckle that sent chills down my spine. I wanted to move seats, to put some distance between us, but something kept me frozen in place. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 15 minutes or so, I worked up the courage to glance back at her. What I saw made my blood run cold. Cradled in her arms was a dead bird, a crow or raven, I think. Its limp body was held tenderly, almost like a baby, while she stroked its feathers with gnarled fingers. I quickly turned back around, my heart pounding in my chest. This was beyond weird. It was downright disturbing. I fumbled for my phone, desperate to distract myself, but of course there was no signal out here in the middle of nowhere. Just then, a sickening crunch came from behind me, followed by wet, smacking sounds. Against my better judgment, I slowly turned my head to look. The sight that greeted me will haunt me for the rest of my days. The old woman had bitten the head clean off the dead bird. Dark blood dribbled down her chin as she chewed. Her rheumy eyes rolled back in apparent ecstasy. I could see bits of brain matter and feathers stuck between her yellowed teeth. The stench of decay filled the air. I let out an involuntary yelp of horror and recoiled. The bus driver called back, asking if everything was all right. I opened my mouth to respond, to beg him to pull over, to do something, anything, but no words came out. I was paralyzed with fear. The old woman fixed her gaze on me then. Her eyes, which had seemed cloudy and unfocused before, were now sharp and alert. A wicked grin spread across her blood-smeared face. She leaned in close and whispered, "Want a taste, dearie?" That was the last straw. Panic overtook me, and I leapt to my feet, intent on getting as far away from this nightmarish scene as possible. But at that very moment there was a deafening screech of tires and a sickening lurch as the bus swerved violently. Everything happened so fast after that. The bus tipped onto its side, sending us all tumbling. There was a cacophony of shattering glass and twisting metal. I was thrown about like a rag doll, my head slamming against something hard. Then everything went black. When I came to, I was lying in a hospital bed. A nurse explained that I had been unconscious for nearly 2 days. The bus had run off the road and rolled down an embankment. Several passengers were injured, but miraculously, no one had died. As my faculties slowly returned, I asked about the old woman. The nurse looked puzzled and consulted my chart. According to the passenger manifest and witness statements, there had been no elderly female passengers on the bus that night. When I described her and insisted she had been sitting right behind me, the nurse gently suggested that I might have imagined her due to the head trauma I'd sustained. But I know what I saw. The memory of that grotesque scene is seared into my brain. Sometimes I can still hear her raspy chuckle in my nightmares, still smell the sickly sweet odor of decay. I've spent countless hours researching, trying to make sense of what happened that night. I've delved into folklore about omens and harbingers of death. I've read accounts of ghostly hitchhikers and phantom travelers. Nothing quite fits, but I'm convinced there was something supernatural at work. Why did only I see her? Was she some kind of spirit or demon? Did she cause the accident somehow? These questions haunt me, keeping me up at night. I've never been able to bring myself to take another bus trip since then. Even being a passenger in a car makes me anxious now. I know how this story must sound to others. If someone had told me this tale before that night, I would have dismissed it as the product of an overactive imagination or a vivid dream. But I know what I experienced was real, no matter how impossible it seems. Sometimes I catch myself scanning crowds, half expecting to see that withered face and those piercing eyes staring back at me. Every time I see an elderly woman on the street, my heart skips a beat. The rational part of my brain knows it's not her, but the fear lingers. I've tried therapy, meditation, even hypnosis to try and come to terms with what happened. Nothing has fully erased the trauma of that night. I still have trouble sleeping, and when I do, my dreams are often filled with images of blood-stained feathers and gnashing teeth. There are times when I question my own sanity. Could the nurse have been right? Did my mind conjure up this horrific scenario as some kind of coping mechanism for the accident? But then I remember the vivid details. The feel of her hot, rancid breath on my neck, the sickening crunch as she bit into that bird, the malevolent gleam in her eyes. It was all too real, too visceral to be a mere hallucination. I've become somewhat obsessed with bus accidents since then, poring over news reports and statistics. I've never found another incident quite like mine, though. No other passengers from that night have come forward with similar stories either. It's as if the old woman existed solely for me, a personal specter sent to torment me. Sometimes I wonder if she was trying to warn me about something. Was the accident inevitable, and her appearance some twisted attempt to prepare me? Or was she actively malevolent, causing the crash for her own inscrutable reasons? I doubt I'll ever know for certain. What I do know is that my life has been irrevocably changed by that encounter. I've become more cautious, more aware of the thin veil between our world and whatever lies beyond. Every unexplained sound, every shadow in the corner of my eye sets my nerves on edge. I'm sharing this story now in the hopes that someone out there might have experienced something similar. Perhaps together we can make sense of these encounters with the unexplainable. Or maybe by putting my story out into the world, I can finally begin to heal and move past that terrifying night. If nothing else, I hope my tale serves as a warning to others. The next time you're traveling alone at night, pay attention to your surroundings. And if an old woman with a dead bird gets on your bus, for the love of all that's holy, get off at the next stop. My assistant, Jake, was dozing off in the seat behind me. We only had a handful of passengers, a couple of college kids heading home for the weekend, an old woman who always took this route on Thursdays to visit her sister, and a businessman who had missed his earlier connection. The low hum of the engine and the gentle sway of the bus had lulled most of them to sleep. I was looking forward to finishing up and heading home myself when something caught my eye in the distance. At first, I thought it was just shadows playing tricks on me. The headlights sometimes created strange patterns on the winding road. But as we got closer, I realized there were people standing on the side of the road. My first instinct was to slow down. It wasn't uncommon for hikers or campers to get stranded out here, especially in the summer months. But something felt off. These figures seemed to materialize out of nowhere, and there were no cars or camping gear visible nearby. As we approached, I could make out more details. There were 5 of them, young adults probably in their early 20s. They were waving their arms frantically, clearly trying to flag us down. I hit the brakes, ready to stop and see if they needed help. That's when things got weird. As soon as the bus started to slow, their demeanor changed completely. Instead of looking relieved that we were stopping, they seemed to panic. They started shouting and gesturing for us to keep going. I couldn't hear what they were saying through the closed windows, but their body language was clear. They wanted us to leave, and fast. I was confused and a bit unnerved. Jake had woken up by this point and was peering out the window, equally puzzled. "What's going on?" he asked, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "I don't know," I replied, my foot hovering between the brake and the accelerator. They were trying to flag us down, but now... One of the young men ran up to the side of the bus, pounding on the door. His face was a mask of terror, his eyes wide and frantic. He was shouting something, but I still couldn't make it out. The other passengers had woken up too, murmuring in confusion and alarm. I made a split-second decision and opened the door. The young man's voice suddenly filled the bus, raw with fear. "Go, you have to go now. Don't stop, just drive." His desperation was palpable, and it sent a chill down my spine. Without thinking, I slammed my foot on the accelerator. The bus lurched forward, and I saw the young man stumble back from the closing door. In my rearview mirror, I could see the group huddled together, still waving us on urgently. And then, in the blink of an eye, they were gone, just vanished. 1 second they were there, illuminated by our taillights, and the next, the road behind us was empty. I kept driving, my heart pounding in my chest. The passengers were all awake now, asking questions, speculating about what had happened. Jake was on his phone, trying to call the police to report the incident. "There's no signal out here," he said, frustration evident in his voice. I nodded, keeping my eyes fixed on the road ahead. "We'll report it when we get to the next town. It's only about 20 minutes away." Those 20 minutes felt like an eternity. Every shadow on the road made me flinch. Every curve filled me with dread that we'd encounter those young people again. But we didn't see anyone else for the rest of the journey. When we finally reached the town, I pulled into the bus station, my hands shaking as I turned off the engine. Jake immediately went to find a phone to call the police, while I tried to calm the passengers and explain what little I knew about what had happened. The police arrived quickly, and we all gave our statements. They seemed skeptical at first, but as each passenger corroborated the story, they became more serious. They told us they'd send a patrol car out to check the area where we'd seen the group. It wasn't until the next day that we found out the truth, and it was far more chilling than anything we could have imagined. The section of road where we'd seen the young people had been the site of a terrible tragedy 5 years ago. A group of 5 college students had been traveling home for spring break when they were forced off the road by an unknown vehicle. They were never seen alive again. Their bodies were found weeks later, deep in the forest. They had been... I can't even bring myself to describe what had been done to them. The case had never been solved, and it had haunted our community ever since. The description of the 5 young people we saw matched the missing students perfectly. Same number, same approximate ages, even similar clothing to what they had been wearing when they disappeared. I've been driving buses for most of my adult life, and I've seen some strange things on the road, but nothing has ever shaken me like this. The terror in that young man's eyes, the desperation in his voice. It haunts me. I can't help but wonder, were they trying to warn us? Protect us from whatever fate had befallen them? I don't have any answers, only questions that keep me up at night. I still drive that route sometimes, and every time I pass that stretch of road, I feel a chill run down my spine. I've never seen those young people again, but sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I think I catch a glimpse of something, a figure standing just beyond the tree line, or a flash of movement in the shadows. I don't know if I believe in ghosts or the supernatural, but I know what I saw that night, and I know that something out there defies explanation. Whatever it was, it left me with a sense of unease that I can't shake, a feeling that there are things in this world that we can't understand or explain. To this day, I'm grateful we didn't stop. I'm grateful we heeded their warning and drove away. But part of me wonders, what if we had stayed? Could we have helped them somehow? Or would we have met the same fate they did, becoming just another unsolved mystery on that lonely stretch of road? I don't have those answers, and maybe I never will. But I know one thing for certain. I'll never forget that night, or the 5 young faces that appeared out of nowhere, desperate to save us from an unseen danger. Wherever they are now, I hope they've found peace. And I hope that someday, someone will be able to unravel the mystery of what really happened on that road, both 5 years ago and on that haunting night when our paths crossed in the most unexpected and chilling way. As the bus pulled away from the station, I settled in for the long ride ahead. I pulled out my phone, planning to listen to some podcasts to pass the time. But something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. The man next to me was perfectly still, staring straight ahead. I snuck a glance at him out of the corner of my eye. He had a gaunt face with sunken cheeks, pale skin that seemed to have a grayish tinge in the dim lighting of the bus. I shrugged it off and turned my attention back to my phone. But as we drove through the outskirts of the city, the streetlights outside created a strobe-like effect, rhythmically illuminating the interior of the bus. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the brief flashes of light from outside, I could see the reflection of the bus interior in the window. I saw my own face staring back at me. But the seat next to me, it was empty in the reflection. I blinked hard, sure I must be seeing things. But no. Each time the light flashed, there was no reflection of the man sitting right beside me. My heart started racing. This couldn't be real. I must be more tired than I realized, my eyes playing tricks on me. I forced myself to turn and look directly at the man. He was still there, solid as ever. But when I looked back at the window, his reflection was gone. I felt a bead of cold sweat trickle down my back. My mouth went dry as cotton. What the hell was going on? I pulled out my phone, pretending to check something, while I snapped a quick picture of our reflection in the window. With shaking hands, I looked at the photo. My blood turned to ice in my veins. The photo showed exactly what I'd seen with my own eyes. Me sitting next to an empty seat, even though I could feel the man's presence right beside me. I suddenly became hyper-aware of every sensation. The scratchy fabric of the seat beneath me, the faint musty smell of the bus, the quiet hum of the engine, and the eerie stillness of the man next to me. He hadn't moved a muscle since I sat down, didn't even seem to be breathing. I had to get away. I stood abruptly, mumbling an excuse about needing the bathroom. As I stumbled down the aisle, my legs felt like jelly beneath me. I locked myself in the tiny bus bathroom, splashing cold water on my face. "Get it together, Mario," I told myself. "You're exhausted and imagining things. When you go back out there, everything will be normal." But when I returned to my seat a few minutes later, the man was gone, vanished without a trace. I sat down, relief washing over me. It had all been in my head after all. I must have dozed off for a moment and dreamed the whole thing up. Just then, a gust of wind rattled the bus windows. I glanced over and nearly screamed out loud. There in the glass was the reflection of the gaunt-faced man, staring right at me with hollow eyes. But the seat beside me was empty. I leapt to my feet, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. "Did anyone see where the man sitting here went?" I asked loudly, my voice shaking. The woman across the aisle looked at me strangely. "What man? That seat's been empty since we left Chicago." I sank back into my seat, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. I was losing it. I closed my eyes, taking deep breaths, willing myself to calm down. When I opened them again, the reflection was gone. The rest of the journey passed in a haze of paranoia and confusion. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even though the seat remained empty. Every time we passed a streetlight, I tensed up, terrified I'd see that ghostly reflection again. But there was nothing. When we finally pulled into Detroit, I practically ran off the bus. I was about to hail a cab when curiosity got the better of me. I had to know if I was going crazy. I approached the bus driver, a friendly-looking older man. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "The seat I was in, 23B, has there ever been any strange occurrences reported there?" The driver's face changed instantly, his jovial expression replaced by one of grim seriousness. "How did you know about that?" he asked in a low voice. My stomach dropped. "Know about what?" He glanced around as if making sure no one else could hear. "That seat, 23B, it's been empty for years. We're not supposed to sell tickets for it. You see, about 15 years ago, there was a terrible accident. The bus went off the road in a snowstorm. Several people died, including a man in that very seat. But here's the thing. They never found his body, and ever since then, people have reported strange things, seeing a man there who vanishes, or seeing no one but feeling a presence. Some even say they've seen his reflection in the window. I felt like the ground was tilting beneath my feet. But I was sitting there. I had a ticket for that seat. The driver's eyes widened. That's impossible. Like I said, we don't sell tickets for 23B anymore. Let me see your ticket stub. With trembling hands, I pulled out my crumpled ticket. Sure enough, it read 23B. The driver's face went pale. "This can't be," he muttered. "There must have been a glitch in the system. I'm so sorry, sir. If I had known..." I barely heard the rest of his apologies. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what had happened. As I finally hailed a cab to take me home, I couldn't shake the image of that gaunt face in the window, those hollow eyes staring at me. That was 3 months ago. I haven't been able to bring myself to take a bus since then. I've scoured the internet for information about the accident, about other people's experiences in that seat. There are whispers, urban legends, but nothing concrete. I still wake up in cold sweats sometimes, the phantom sensation of someone sitting next to me lingering, even as I open my eyes to an empty room. And every time I pass a darkened window, I can't help but glance at my reflection and brace myself for what else I might see staring back at me. I don't know what happened that night. Was it all in my head? Some sort of mass hallucination? Or did I somehow cross paths with something not of this world? All I know is that I'll never forget those eyes in the window, or the chill that ran through me when I realized I was sitting in a dead man's seat. If you're ever on a night bus and find yourself in seat 23B, my advice is simple. Move, and whatever you do, don't look at the window reflections. Some things are better left unseen. It had been a quiet night so far, just a handful of passengers dozing in their seats as we made our way between towns. I'd been driving this route for over a decade now, and I knew every curve and pothole like the back of my hand. The monotony of the familiar road usually lulled me into an almost trance-like state on these overnight drives. But something felt different that night. There was a heaviness in the air, an uneasy tension that I couldn't quite place. I found myself gripping the steering wheel a bit tighter than usual, my eyes straining to peer into the inky blackness beyond the reach of the headlights. As I rounded a bend, something caught my eye up ahead, a flash of white by the side of the road. My heart began to race as I slowed the bus, squinting to make out what it was. And then I saw her. A woman was standing on the shoulder, her arm outstretched in the universal gesture for hitchhiking. She wore a simple white dress that seemed to glow in the darkness. As I drew closer, I could make out more details. Long dark hair, pale skin, eyes that seemed to bore right through me. I felt the blood drain from my face as recognition hit me like a punch to the gut. It was her. The woman from that night 5 years ago, the one who had been dragged screaming from her car by those men with guns, the one whose fate had haunted my nightmares ever since. I slammed on the brakes, the bus screeching to a halt about 50 feet from where she stood. My hands were shaking as I stared at her through the windshield. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be her. And yet, she looked exactly the same as she had that night. Same dress, same haunted expression. She hadn't aged a day. My mind reeled as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. One of the passengers stirred, mumbling a groggy, "Why'd we stop?" I ignored them, unable to tear my eyes away from the apparition before me. Slowly, deliberately, she began walking towards the bus. Her bare feet made no sound on the pavement. My entire body was rigid with fear, but I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. She stopped just outside the door, those piercing eyes locked onto mine. With trembling fingers, I reached for the door controls. Some distant part of my brain screamed at me not to do it, but I felt powerless to resist. The door hissed open. "Please," she whispered, her voice carrying an otherworldly echo. "I need a ride." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. She took a step forward, one foot on the bottom step. I could see goosebumps rising on her arms. "It's so cold out here," she said softly. "Won't you help me?" My hand hovered over the gear shift, ready to slam it into drive and get the hell out of there. But something held me back. The raw desperation in her eyes, the plea in her voice. It stirred something deep within me. A need to help, to make amends for not stopping that night so long ago. Where are you going?" I finally managed to croak out. A sad smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Home," she replied simply. "I've been trying to get home for so long." I swallowed hard, my throat bone dry. "Get in," I heard myself say. She glided up the steps, that white dress swirling around her legs. I expected her to take one of the empty seats, but instead she remained standing next to me. I could feel the chill emanating from her, like standing next to an open freezer. My fingers shook as I shifted into drive and eased the bus forward. We rode in silence for several minutes, the only sound the quiet rumble of the engine and my own ragged breathing. "I remember you," she said suddenly, making me jump. "You were there that night. You saw what happened." I gripped the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I should have stopped. Should have tried to help somehow. I was just so scared." She placed a hand on my shoulder. It felt like ice seeping through my uniform shirt. "It's all right," she murmured. "There was nothing you could have done." I shuddered, blinking back tears. "What happened to you?" I asked, dreading the answer but needing to know. She was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was distant, as if coming from very far away. "They took me to a place of darkness, of pain. I tried to escape so many times, but they always dragged me back. Until one day, I found a way out." A chill ran down my spine. I wanted to ask more, but the words stuck in my throat. "This is my stop," she said suddenly. I looked around in confusion. We were in the middle of nowhere, nothing but dense forest on either side of the road. "Here, but there's nothing." My words died as I turned back to her. Where she had been standing moments before, there was only empty space. My eyes darted wildly around the bus, but she was gone, vanished into thin air. I slammed on the brakes, the bus screeching to a halt. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst from my chest. With shaking hands, I opened the door and stumbled out onto the road. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the still night air. "Are you there?" No response, just the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. I don't know how long I stood there, searching the darkness for any sign of her. Eventually, one of the passengers came to check on me. I mumbled some excuse about engine trouble and climbed back behind the wheel. As I drove on, my mind raced. Had it all been a hallucination? Some kind of waking nightmare brought on by guilt and lack of sleep? But it had felt so real. I could still feel the icy touch of her hand on my shoulder. Over the next few weeks, I became obsessed with finding answers. I scoured old newspaper archives, looking for any mention of her abduction. I drove that stretch of road over and over on my days off, hoping for another glimpse. And then I started hearing the whispers. Other drivers on the overnight routes talking in hushed tones about a woman in white seen walking along the roadside, always in the same spot, always vanishing without a trace. I don't know what to believe anymore. Was she a ghost? A lost soul seeking redemption? Or something else entirely? All I know is that I'll never forget that night, or the haunted eyes of the woman who disappeared. Sometimes, on dark nights when I'm driving that lonely road, I find myself scanning the shadows, hoping to see her again, dreading it too, because deep down, I know that if I do, it will mean facing the terrifying truth of what really happened that night so long ago. And I'm not sure I'm ready for that. Not sure I'll ever be ready. But still, I drive on, watching, waiting, wondering if tonight will be the night she appears again, seeking a ride to a home she can never truly reach. And I know that if she does, I'll stop. I'll open that door, because this time I won't let fear hold me back. This time I'll do whatever it takes to help her find peace, even if it means following her into the darkness myself. Just as the bus was about to depart, an elderly gentleman hurried on board. He was tall and thin, with wispy white hair and wire-rimmed glasses. Despite his age, he moved with surprising agility. The old man made his way down the aisle and stopped right next to the young guy's seat. "Mind if I sit here, son?" he asked in a gentle voice. The young man looked up, startled. Sure," he mumbled, shifting over to make room. As the bus pulled away from the station, I couldn't help but observe the odd pair. The elderly man chatted easily, while the younger one seemed tense and uncomfortable. I figured they must be strangers, the classic talkative old guy, trapped younger seatmate dynamic you often see on public transport. But as the night wore on, things got weird, really weird. A couple hours into the trip, I got up to use the restroom. As I walked past their row, I overheard a snippet of conversation that made me pause. "I know you're worried about the interview, Tommy," the old man was saying. "But you'll do great. You've always had a knack for computers, just like your father." Tommy. The name tugged at my memory. Hadn't the elderly passenger called the young guy son earlier? But this sounded more like a grandfather talking. On my way back to my seat, I glanced over again. The old man caught my eye and gave me a friendly nod. There was something oddly familiar about his face, but I couldn't place it. As the night deepened, most passengers drifted off to sleep, but I found myself wide awake, inexplicably unsettled. I kept stealing glances at the mismatched pair a few rows up. The young man, Tommy, had finally relaxed a bit. He was showing the older guy something on his phone, gesturing excitedly. The grandfather listened attentively, beaming with pride. Around 2 a.m., we stopped at a rest area in Pennsylvania. As passengers shuffled off to stretch their legs, I noticed Tommy head to the snack machines alone. The old man stayed behind. When Tommy returned, clutching a bag of chips, he paused in the aisle. For a moment, he stared at the empty seat beside him, looking confused. Then he shook his head and sat back down. My skin prickled. What was going on? As we rolled back onto the highway, I watched Tommy more closely. He seemed agitated again, muttering to himself and running his hands through his hair. But the seat next to him remained empty. Just as I was starting to think I'd imagined the whole thing, the old man reappeared. He came walking down the aisle from the back of the bus, smiling and nodding at other passengers as he passed. But no one reacted to him. Not a single person looked up or moved aside. My heart began to race. This couldn't be happening. The elderly man slipped back into his seat next to Tommy. Immediately, the young man's posture relaxed. He turned to his companion, lips moving in conversation I couldn't hear. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to wake up from this dream. But when I looked again, the scene was unchanged. For the next few hours, I watched in mounting horror as the ghostly grandfather comforted and encouraged his oblivious grandson. Sometimes he would vanish for a while, only to reappear in a different part of the bus. Once, I saw him standing in the aisle, gazing out the window at the pre-dawn landscape rushing by. No one else seemed to notice him, not the driver, not the other passengers, not even Tommy when the old man wasn't directly interacting with him. It was as if he existed in some in-between state, visible only to me and partially to his grandson. As sunrise painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, we entered New Jersey. The bus grew livelier as people began to stir. I hadn't slept a wink, my mind reeling from the impossible things I'd witnessed. We were about an hour outside New York when it happened. The old man stood up suddenly, patting Tommy on the shoulder. "Well, this is where I get off, son. You'll do just fine in that interview. Remember what I taught you. Be confident, speak clearly, and let your passion shine through." Tommy nodded, smiling. "Thanks, Grandpa. I'm glad you were here." My breath caught in my throat, so I hadn't imagined it. This really was Tommy's grandfather. But how? The old man walked to the front of the bus. For a moment he turned and looked directly at me. His eyes twinkled with a knowing gleam. Then, between one blink and the next, he was gone. I sat in stunned silence as we pulled into Port Authority bus terminal. As passengers began gathering their belongings, I watched Tommy stand and stretch. He looked around in confusion, as if he'd lost something. Then he shrugged, grabbed his backpack, and joined the line of people exiting the bus. I hung back, my legs shaky. As I finally stepped onto the sidewalk, the crisp morning air helped clear my head a bit, but I still felt dazed, struggling to process what I'd experienced. Part of me wanted to run after Tommy, to ask him about his grandfather, but what would I even say? "Hey, I saw your dead grandpa's ghost on the bus all night?" He'd think I was insane. As I hailed a taxi to my hotel, my mind raced. Had I really seen a spirit, or was it all just a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and the liminal space of nighttime travel? But deep down, I knew. Whatever I'd witnessed on that bus was real. Somehow, someway, a loving grandfather had found a way to be there for his grandson when he needed support most. I've taken many bus trips since that night, but I've never again experienced anything like those surreal hours with Tommy and his spectral guardian. Sometimes I wonder if I ever will. Part of me hopes so. It was terrifying, yes, but also oddly beautiful. And every time I pass Port Authority now, I can't help but glance around, just in case I spot a tall, thin man with wispy white hair and wire-rimmed glasses, smiling that knowing smile. It all started when Emilio turned 7. He'd always been a curious kid, but suddenly he began acting strange. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find his bed empty, the window left open. At first I thought he was just sneaking out to play. We'd done it before on warm summer nights, but something felt off. One night I decided to follow him. I crept out of our room and down to the beach, staying hidden behind the dunes. That's when I saw it. Emilio walking slowly towards the old wooden pier, his eyes fixed on something in the water. As I got closer, I heard it too, a haunting melody drifting in on the night air. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, both beautiful and terrifying at the same time. I watched in horror as Emilio reached the end of the pier and knelt down, peering into the dark water below. And then I saw them, pale, distorted faces emerging from the waves. They were like nothing I'd ever seen before, not quite human, not quite fish. Their eyes were huge and bulging, their mouths filled with razor-sharp teeth. Webbed hands reached up towards my brother, and I had to bite back a scream. But Emilio wasn't afraid. He smiled and reached out to touch one of the creatures, as if greeting an old friend. They spoke to him in a language I couldn't understand, all clicks and whistles that somehow seemed to make sense to my little brother. I was frozen in place, unable to move or call out. After what felt like hours, Emilio finally stood up and made his way back to shore. The creatures sank back beneath the waves, but I could still feel their eyes on me as I raced home, my heart pounding in my chest. The next morning, I tried to talk to Emilio about what I'd seen, but he just looked at me with confusion. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. "I was in bed all night." But I could see the lie in his eyes and the hint of a secret smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't tell our parents. They'd never believe me. And part of me was afraid of what might happen if I tried to stop Emilio from going to the pier. So I watched and waited, following him night after night as he met with those things in the water. As the weeks went by, I noticed changes in my brother. His skin took on a pale, almost greenish tint. His eyes seemed to grow larger, and I swore I could see the beginning of webbing between his fingers. He spent more and more time in the bathtub, and I'd often find him staring longingly out at the sea. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know what. That's when I overheard old Tom, one of the village fishermen, talking to my father. "It's happening again," he said in a low, worried voice. "Just like it did 30 years ago. The children are being called." My father tried to brush it off, but I could see the fear in his eyes. Later that night, I snuck out to old Tom's house and begged him to tell me what he meant. The old man sighed heavily and invited me inside. "It's an old story," he began, his weathered hands wrapped around a mug of strong tea. "Every few decades the sea folk come. They lure our children away with their songs and promises of a magical underwater world, but those who go never return." I felt my blood run cold. "What happens to them?" Old Tom shook his head sadly. "No one knows for sure. Some say they become like the sea folk themselves. Others say, well, best not to think about it." I left old Tom's house with a heavy heart and a growing sense of dread. I knew I had to save Emilio, but how? I couldn't watch him every night, and I was terrified of what might happen if I tried to confront the creatures directly. The next few nights were a blur of fear and sleepless vigils. I tried everything I could think of to keep Emilio in bed, hiding his shoes, locking the window, even tying a bell to his ankle. But somehow he always managed to slip away. It all came to a head on a stormy night in late autumn. The wind howled outside our window, and the waves crashed against the shore with a fury I'd never seen before. I woke with a start, somehow knowing that this was it. This was the night they would try to take Emilio for good. I raced down to the beach, my bare feet slipping on the wet sand. The pier creaked and groaned under the assault of the waves, and I could barely make out Emilio's small form at the end of it. The sea was churning with pale bodies, their arms reaching up towards my brother. "Emilio!" I screamed, my voice nearly lost in the roar of the storm. "Emilio, come back!" For a moment he turned to look at me, but his eyes were different now, huge and glassy, reflecting the ghostly light of the creatures below. He smiled, and I saw rows of sharp teeth gleaming in his mouth. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, my lungs burning as I sprinted down the pier. Just as I reached out to grab Emilio, a massive wave crashed over us both. I felt myself being pulled under, tumbling in the icy water. Panic set in as I realized I couldn't tell which way was up. And then I saw them. Dozens of those hideous faces surrounding me, their webbed hands grasping at my clothes and skin. I thrashed and kicked, fighting with everything I had. In the chaos, I caught a glimpse of Emilio. He was floating peacefully, his eyes closed, and a serene smile on his face, as the creatures pulled him deeper into the darkness. I don't know how I made it back to shore. My next clear memory is of lying on the beach, coughing up seawater as the storm raged on. Emilio was gone. The official story is that he was swept out to sea by a rogue wave. The village mourned and life slowly returned to normal. But I know the truth. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I still hear that eerie melody drifting in on the breeze. And when I look out at the water, I swear I can see a small face watching me from just beneath the waves, familiar yet terrifyingly changed. I've never told anyone the full story of what happened that night. Who would believe me? But I know that somewhere out there, in the depths of the ocean, my little brother swims with the monsters, and I live with the guilt of not being able to save him, always wondering if someday they'll come back for me too. I was always fascinated by the mysteries hidden in the ancient mountains of South America. As a geologist, I spent years studying rock formations and dreaming of making groundbreaking discoveries, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered in that remote village high in the Andes. It was supposed to be a routine field expedition, collect some samples, map the local geology, maybe find some interesting minerals. I had done trips like this dozens of times before, but from the moment I arrived in the tiny indigenous community of Huaylapa, I could sense something was different. The villagers eyed me warily as I made my way down the single dirt road into town. Children who had been playing in the street quickly scurried inside as I passed. Even the dogs seemed unusually quiet, watching me intently from the shadows. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, chalking it up to the natural wariness remote communities often have towards outsiders. I managed to find the village elder and, through my rudimentary Quechua and a lot of gesturing, explained the purpose of my visit. He nodded gravely as I pointed to my geological equipment and made motions of examining rocks. But when I unfolded my map and indicated the area I planned to survey, his demeanor changed instantly. He began speaking rapidly, shaking his head and making emphatic slashing motions with his hands. I didn't need to understand the words to get the message. That area was strictly off limits. I tried to press for more information, but he simply turned and walked away, leaving me standing confused in the village square. Over the next few days, I tried to go about my work as planned, taking samples from the areas immediately surrounding the village. But I couldn't stop thinking about that forbidden zone. What was out there that had the villagers so spooked? My scientific curiosity was piqued. On my third night in Huaylapa, I overheard two younger men talking in broken Spanish outside the hut where I was staying. I caught fragments about the Sendero Olvidado, the forgotten path. They spoke in hushed, fearful tones about strange lights seen in that area and people who had ventured there and returned, changed. I knew I should heed the warnings. Every instinct told me to leave well enough alone. But the next morning, I found myself packing extra supplies and heading out towards the Sendero Olvidado before dawn. The path was overgrown and clearly hadn't been used in years. As I hiked deeper into the mountains, the air grew noticeably colder, and a thick mist began to settle around me. The silence was eerie. No birds, no insects, not even the sound of the wind. Just my own labored breathing and the crunch of gravel under my boots. After several hours, I came upon a wide clearing ringed by jagged rock formations. In the center stood a crumbling stone altar, covered in strange symbols I didn't recognize. Scattered around were bits of clay pottery, bleached animal bones, and what looked like the remains of ancient fire pits. My heart was racing as I examined the scene. This was clearly the site of some kind of ritual, possibly dating back centuries. But there was something else, a palpable sense of wrongness that I couldn't explain. The air felt thick and oppressive, like the moment before a thunderstorm. I took some photos and samples, working as quickly as I could. But as I was packing up my gear, I noticed something glinting in the dirt near the altar. I brushed away the soil to reveal a small gold figurine, intricately carved in the shape of a snarling feline. Without thinking, I pocketed it. That was my first mistake. As I made my way back down the mountain, the mist grew so thick I could barely see 10 feet in front of me. Several times I lost the trail completely, stumbling through the underbrush. The temperature plummeted, and an unnatural darkness fell, even though it was barely mid-afternoon. When I finally staggered back into the village, exhausted and disoriented, the reaction of the locals chilled me to the bone. Women grabbed their children and hurried inside. Men crossed themselves and muttered prayers. The elder who had warned me off initially just stared at me with a mixture of fear and pity. That night, things got even stranger. I woke suddenly around midnight, with the distinct feeling I was being watched. Peering out the window of my hut, I saw a group of figures standing motionless at the edge of the village, all wearing elaborate animal masks. In the moonlight, their eyes seemed to glow with an otherworldly light. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, sure I must be dreaming. But when I looked again, they were still there. As I watched, paralyzed, they began to sway rhythmically, chanting in a language I didn't recognize. The sound made my skin crawl. Suddenly, there was a soft knock at my door. I nearly jumped out of my skin. Cautiously, I opened it to find a wizened old woman standing there. Without a word, she pressed something into my hand, a small leather pouch on a cord. Then she was gone, melting into the shadows. Inside the pouch was a crude stone amulet, carved with symbols similar to those I had seen on the altar. A wave of dizziness washed over me as I held it. For a brief moment, I thought I heard whispering voices, speaking words just beyond my comprehension. I barely slept for the rest of the night. When dawn finally broke, I hurriedly packed my things, desperate to get out of Huaylapa and back to civilization. As I was loading my jeep, the village elder approached. He spoke just 2 words in heavily accented English. "It follows." The drive back to Cusco was a blur. I kept checking the rearview mirror, unable to shake the feeling that something was pursuing me. More than once, I thought I glimpsed masked figures standing by the roadside, but they would vanish when I looked again. Even after I returned home, the strangeness persisted. My dreams were plagued by visions of that mountain clearing and the chanting figures. I would wake in a cold sweat, certain that something was lurking in the dark corners of my bedroom. The samples I collected yielded nothing unusual under analysis. The photos from the site came out blurry and indistinct. I still have the gold figurine and the stone amulet, but I'm afraid to look at them too closely. Sometimes I think I hear them whispering to each other late at night. It's been months now, and I still can't shake the feeling that I brought something back with me from the Sendero Olvidado. Something ancient and hungry that's been waiting a very long time to be rediscovered. I catch glimpses of it out of the corner of my eye. A fleeting shadow, a flash of yellow eyes, gone before I can focus on it. I've tried to research the history of the area, looking for any clues about what I might have encountered. But information is scarce, and what little I've found is vague and contradictory. There are hints of a long-forgotten cult, of rituals to appease dark forces that dwell in the mountains, but nothing concrete. The amulet the old woman gave me seems to offer some protection. When I wear it, the shadows retreat and the whispering fades, but I can feel it growing weaker, its power ebbing away. I don't know what will happen when it fails completely. I should have listened to the warnings. I should have left the Sendero Olvidado to its secrets. But it's too late now. Whatever I awakened there has marked me, claimed me, and I fear it's only a matter of time before it comes to collect. So I'm sharing my story as a warning to others. There are places in this world that should remain undisturbed, mysteries better left unsolved. The Sendero Olvidado is one of them. If you ever find yourself in those mountains, heed the locals' warnings. Don't let curiosity overcome caution, because once you step onto that forgotten path, there's no turning back. I don't know what the future holds for me, but I do know that I'll never be free of what I experienced in Huaylapa. The Sendero Olvidado may be forgotten by most, but it will haunt me for the rest of my days. And in my darkest moments, I fear those days may be numbered. So if you're reading this and you're planning a trip to the Andes, or any other remote area steeped in ancient mysteries, think twice. Some secrets are meant to stay buried. Some paths are meant to remain untrodden. Learn from my mistake before it's too late. As I cruised down the empty highway, I spotted an old dirt road leading off into a vast field. With no other options in sight, I decided to follow it, hoping it might lead to a farm where I could ask to camp out for the night. The road seemed to go on forever. Nothing but golden wheat swaying in the breeze as far as the eye could see. Just when I was about to give up and turn back, I saw it. An old abandoned farmhouse looming in the distance. It was a decrepit two-story affair, paint peeling and shutters hanging crooked. Not exactly the Ritz, but it would do in a pinch. I pulled up to the house, the rumble of my bike shattering the eerie silence. As I killed the engine, a feeling of unease settled over me. Something about this place felt off. I shook it off, chalking it up to too many hours on the road. Before heading inside, I decided to check out the small town I'd passed through about 10 miles back. I needed to grab some food and water anyway. The sun had fully set by the time I rolled into the sleepy little town. Most businesses were closed, but I found a small general store still open. As I gathered supplies, I casually mentioned to the old man behind the counter that I was planning to crash at the abandoned farmhouse down the road. His eyes went wide, and he gripped the edge of the counter so hard his knuckles turned white. "Son, you don't want to go anywhere near that place," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Strange things happen out there. People go missing, hear things that ain't natural." I laughed it off, assuring him I'd be fine. But as I walked out, I couldn't shake the chill that ran down my spine. What was it about that house that spooked the locals so bad? Back at the farmhouse, I tried to put the old man's warning out of my mind as I set up camp in what used to be the living room. The floorboards creaked ominously under my feet, and musty air filled my lungs. But it beats sleeping outside, I told myself. I laid out my sleeping bag, ate some of the food I'd bought, and settled in for the night. Sleep came fitfully, my mind conjuring up all sorts of ridiculous scenarios based on the old man's cryptic warning. I'm not sure how long I'd been asleep when a sound jolted me awake. Footsteps. Heavy, slow footsteps creaking on the floor above me. My heart began to race. I was sure I was alone in this house. I sat up, straining my ears in the darkness. The footsteps continued, moving from one end of the upstairs to the other. Then they stopped, right at the top of the stairs. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense. For what felt like an eternity, there was only silence. Then a single thunderous footstep on the top stair. I scrambled for my flashlight, flicking it on just as another step creaked. The beam of light illuminated the staircase, but there was nothing there, just empty, rotting steps. And yet the sound continued. Step by agonizing step, something unseen descended the stairs. My mind reeled, unable to process what was happening. This couldn't be real. I had to be dreaming. But the cold sweat on my skin and the hammering of my heart told me this was all too real. As the invisible presence reached the bottom of the stairs, I bolted. I didn't even bother to grab my stuff. I just ran, bursting out the front door into the cool night air. Outside wasn't much better. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw shapes moving in the wheat field. Tall, unnaturally thin silhouettes gliding between the stalks. They seemed to be closing in on the house, on me. I sprinted to my bike, fumbling with the keys as I tried to start it. The engine roared to life and I tore down the dirt road, not daring to look back. The shapes in the field seemed to be keeping pace, always just at the edge of my vision. As I hit the main road, I thought I was in the clear, but then something darted out in front of me, a humanoid figure, but wrong somehow. Its limbs were too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. I swerved hard, nearly laying the bike down as I narrowly avoided it. I rode hard through the night, not stopping until the sun began to peek over the horizon. Only then did I pull over at a truck stop, my hands shaking as I tried to process what I'd seen. To this day, I can't explain what happened at that farmhouse. Was it all in my head? Some kind of mass hallucination brought on by exhaustion? Or was there really something supernatural out there in that lonely field? All I know is I'll never forget the terror of that night. The sound of those footsteps coming down the stairs, the shapes moving in the wheat, and that thing that ran out in front of my bike. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear those heavy footsteps in my dreams. I've tried to research the history of that house to find some explanation for what I experienced, but there's surprisingly little information available. It's as if the locals have collectively decided to pretend it doesn't exist. The few scraps I've managed to find are troubling. There are whispered stories of disappearances over the years, of strange lights seen in the fields at night, of inhuman screams echoing across the prairie. One account, from a farmer in the 1950s, described seeing men made of shadow walking through his wheat field, leaving no trace behind. Another, from a teenager in the 80s, talked about a friend who went missing after they dared each other to spend the night in the house. But it's all hearsay and urban legend. Nothing concrete, nothing that explains what I saw and heard that night. I've thought about going back, trying to face my fears and get some answers, but every time I consider it, I remember the pure, primal terror I felt. The certainty that if I had stayed in that house even a minute longer, something truly horrific would have happened. so I stay away. I avoid long solo road trips now, especially through rural areas, and I never ever spend the night in abandoned buildings. Some doors once opened can never be fully closed again, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. But I can't help but wonder, how many others have stumbled upon that house over the years? How many have experienced what I did, or worse? And what really lurks in those wheat fields when the sun goes down? I may never know the answers, but one thing's for certain. I'll never forget that night. The night I learned that sometimes the old stories and warnings exist for a reason. That there are places in this world where the veil between realities is thin and things beyond our understanding can slip through. If you're ever driving through the Midwest and come across a lonely farmhouse standing in a sea of wheat, do yourself a favor. Keep driving. Don't let curiosity get the better of you. Because some places are meant to be left alone, and some experiences are better left in the realm of nightmares. I was driving my grandmother to her old friend's funeral when our trip took an unexpected turn. The winding mountain road stretched out before us, trees casting long shadows as the sun dipped lower on the horizon. Grandma had insisted on making the journey, despite her age and frailty. Margaret was there for me during the darkest days of my life, she'd said. I owe it to her to say goodbye. As we climbed higher into the mountains, the air grew cooler and a light mist clung to the roadside. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, hyper-aware of the steep drop-offs just beyond the guardrails. Grandma dozed in the passenger seat, her weathered hands folded in her lap. The first sign of trouble came with a sickening thump from the rear of the car. The steering jerked in my hands as we veered dangerously close to the edge. Heart pounding, I managed to guide us onto a narrow gravel pull-off. "What's happening, dear?" Grandma's voice was groggy with sleep. "I think we have a flat tire," I said, trying to keep the panic from my voice. "Stay here while I take a look." Stepping out of the car, the chill mountain air raised goosebumps on my arms. Sure enough, our back right tire was completely deflated. I stood there for a moment, mind racing. We were miles from the nearest town with no cell service. The sun was rapidly sinking, painting the sky in ominous shades of red and purple. As I debated our limited options, the rumble of an engine caught my attention. A battered pickup truck came around the bend, slowing as it approached. My pulse quickened. Out here, alone and vulnerable, a stranger could mean help or danger. The truck crawled to a stop about 20 feet behind us. Its windows were tinted so dark I couldn't make out the driver. For what felt like an eternity, nothing happened. The truck just sat there, engine idling. I could feel eyes on me, but couldn't see anyone inside. "Everything all right, honey?" Grandma called from the car. "It's fine," I lied, not wanting to worry her. "Just checking something." The silence stretched on, broken only by the low rumble of the pickup's engine. My skin crawled with the sensation of being watched. I found myself taking a step back towards our car, ready to jump in and lock the doors. Just as I was about to make a run for it, the pickup's engine cut off. The driver's door creaked open, and a tall figure emerged. In the fading light, I could just make out the shape of a man. He approached slowly, hands raised in a non-threatening gesture. "Looks like you folks could use some help," he called out, his voice unexpectedly gentle. As he drew closer, I could see he was older than I'd first thought. Probably in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes. He wore faded jeans and a flannel shirt. looking every bit the part of a local. "Flat tire," I explained, still wary. "We don't have cell service up here." He nodded knowingly. "Yeah, reception's spotty in these parts. Lucky for you, I never go anywhere without my tools. Mind if I take a look?" Before I could respond, I heard Grandma's door open. Jack Miller, is that you?" The man's eyes widened in recognition. "Well, I'll be damned. Evelyn, what on earth are you doing way out here?" To my utter bewilderment, Grandma tottered over and embraced the stranger like a long-lost friend. "We're on our way to Margaret's funeral," she explained. "This is my granddaughter, Lisa." Jack's face grew solemn. "Ah, I heard about Margaret. I'm sorry for your loss, Evelyn. She was a fine woman." As they chatted, I stood there in stunned silence. How did my grandmother know this random mechanic on a remote mountain road? Seeming to sense my confusion, Grandma turned to me. "Jack here is Tommy Miller's boy. You remember me telling you about Tommy? He and your grandfather were thick as thieves back in the day." Jack chuckled. "That they were. Dad always said your granddad was the only one who could keep up with him on these mountain roads." He glanced at our car. "Speaking of which, let's get you ladies back on the road before it gets too dark." As Jack set to work changing our tire, I pulled Grandma aside. "This is quite a coincidence," I whispered. She patted my arm, a knowing twinkle in her eye. "Is it, dear? I've always believed there are no true coincidences in this life. Sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places." I mulled over her words as I watched Jack work. The odds of running into someone connected to our family out here in the middle of nowhere seemed astronomical. Yet here we were. As Jack finished up, I noticed the pickup truck that had unnerved me earlier was nowhere to be seen. "Did you see another vehicle pass by while we were talking?" I asked. Jack looked puzzled. "Can't say that I did. It's been mighty quiet up here all afternoon." A chill ran down my spine. I was certain that truck had been there, watching us. Where had it gone, and why hadn't Jack seen it? With the spare tire in place, we were ready to continue our journey. As I thanked Jack profusely, he waved off my attempts to pay him. "Consider it a favor to an old family friend," he said with a wink. As we pulled back onto the road, the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the mountains. I couldn't shake the feeling that something truly strange had transpired. The menacing truck, Jack's timely arrival, my grandmother's cryptic words about coincidences. It all swirled in my mind. "Grandma," I said hesitantly, "do you really think it was just chance that Jack showed up when we needed help?" She was quiet for a long moment, gazing out at the darkening landscape. When she spoke, her voice was soft, but filled with conviction. "I've lived a long life, dear. I've seen things that can't be explained by mere chance or coincidence. Sometimes I think there are forces at work in this world that we can't begin to understand." I thought about the unseen driver in the pickup watching us. Had that been a threat? And if so, had Jack's arrival somehow averted danger? The idea sent a shiver through me. "Your grandfather always said these mountains had their own kind of magic," Grandma continued. "He believed they looked after those who respected them. Maybe he was right." As if on cue, the mist that had been clinging to the roadside began to thicken. It swirled around our car, creating an otherworldly atmosphere. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw shapes in the fog. Guardian spirits of the mountains, perhaps? I shook my head, chalking it up to an overactive imagination fueled by the day's strange events. Yet as we continued our drive, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched over, protected on our journey. We arrived at our destination without further incident, the strange encounter on the mountain fading like a half-remembered dream. But in quiet moments, I often find myself thinking back to that day, about the menacing truck that vanished into thin air and the timely arrival of a helper with ties to our past. Was it all just an improbable series of coincidences, or had we experienced something truly unexplainable? A moment where the veil between worlds grew thin and unseen forces reached out to guide us? I may never know for certain, but one thing's for sure. I'll never look at a mountain road the same way again. And whenever I'm facing a seemingly impossible situation, I think back to that misty evening and remember, sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places.